The magnificent castle, surrounded by green gardens, rose majestically, its snow-white walls, reflecting the light, and its blue roofs, like bright accents, contrasted beautifully with the surrounding nature, creating an atmosphere of tranquility. The boy was given a little squirrel friend with red fur, big expressive eyes, and a nut securely clutched in his little paws. That gift was a real miracle for him. A young aristocrat named Tizen looked at his new companion with admiration and genuine interest. Next to him stood an adult lady elegantly dressed in a dark dress, her eyes full of concern and attention to the young man's every gesture. The boy was quite attractive, with bright red eyes, jet black hair, and freckles, and his gaze clearly showed joy and gratitude because now he had a small and faithful friend. The woman was incredibly pleased that she had been able to please the young aristocrat by giving him such a symbolic and sacred creature as a squirrel, which, as if from a temple, brought a piece of magic and miracles into his life. The squirrel, sitting quietly in his cage, silently listened to the conversation of the nobles, his attention riveted on their words, while an aura of mystery and sophistication reigned around, giving everything a special charm. Once in this cage, the animal surprisingly turned out to be a lady who had completely accidentally ended up in a romantic novel, becoming a squirrel, observing the life of a young villain, still a child, and his caring mother. She was filled with disappointment and despondency because instead of becoming a human, she became part of a gift, nothing more than a cute little animal trapped in a cage, and could not change her fate even if she tried. The little pet, agitated and angry, was furiously beating his fists on the cage, desperately wanting to get out to freedom. His gaze was full of dissatisfaction, and he could not come to terms with this situation. The Duchy of Kairad, whose coat of arms featured a blue rose intertwined with two swords, seemed to embody courage and nobility, carrying within itself the grandeur of ancient history and symbolizing the strength of this outstanding land. The head of this extraordinary family was a magician who possessed incredible power. His magical abilities were so great that he seemed almost invincible, and his power embodied the full power of ancient spells. But this unimaginable power had its terrible price. The more magic a person absorbed, the more excruciating his suffering became, and pain became his constant companion on the path to greatness. However, among the many creatures in the temple, there was one sacred creature, a squirrel, which could comfort and calm the magicians, returning them to peace and inner harmony, restoring clarity of mind, and cleansing them of chaos. That is why Duchess Ella, understanding the importance of such a decision, did not skimp on a significant sum to purchase this unusual animal for her son, knowing that it would become a reliable support in difficult times. All the nobles watching the boy could not hide their envious admiration because on his shoulder sat a magical beast, which was his faithful companion and helped him contain such a powerful force. However, the squirrel, although a sacred creature, could not hide her displeasure and doubted that her new master was even capable of lighting a fire, let alone controlling his magic. The little beast instantly responded to the noblewoman's call, jumping into her arms with grace and speed, as if the very movement concealed the confidence that only he could provide her with the help she needed at that moment. The squirrel settled comfortably in the lady's palm, and she happily declared that this creature was surprisingly obedient, since even the most demanding magicians cannot always boast of such behavior in their pets. Tizen stared at the squirrel thoughtfully and with a clearly critical gaze, his eyes trying to penetrate every detail, as if he was looking for hidden features that might reveal the true nature of this mysterious creature. The boy frowned and said with an expression of obvious disgust that he would not at all like this beast to be able to understand human speech, because such a thought seemed frightening and unnecessary to him. The lady in the body of an animal moved away furiously, in complete shock, from the lie of the boy, who a few minutes ago called her sweet and charming, and now suddenly recognized her as disgusting. The woman handed the squirrel over to her son, gently reminding him that it was not just a cute animal, but a sacred creature with special meaning and power, and its purpose was much more important than just being a pet. Tizen listened thoughtfully to his mother, as she explained that there were rumors that such pets were capable of turning into humans, which added a mysterious quality to the creature that he had not yet considered. The boy nodded, agreeing with his mother, realizing that being a powerful magician, he undoubtedly had to have an equally powerful pet, which according to the laws of nature, had to be no less powerful than its owner. With a confident smile, Tizen said that it looked like he would soon have to look after a new slave, which made the squirrel shudder in fear, as she instantly realized that this little rascal was already making sinister plans. The young man held his nose in the air with obvious arrogance, as if the world were under his fingernails, while his pet, his eyes blazing, looked at him with anger and deep hatred and disgust, his patience already running out. The little animal, trembling with anger and internal struggle, barely restrained himself, trying not to hit this little gentleman, who seemed so helpless and arrogant to him, but a furious fire burned in his eyes. On the other hand, despite everything that was happening, she was relatively comfortable being in the Duke's castle, among those who held evil in power, where she could hide from view and calmly observe all the intrigues and events. There, in a high tower, lived an important character whose presence was hidden from the eyes of most, but his role in the life of the duchy remained key, and his influence was felt in every corner of this gloomy castle. The woman turned sharply when she heard the man from the tower approach the castle, as if her intuition told her that this event was hiding something important that required immediate attention, and her gaze immediately became wary and tense. The servants, modestly bowing their heads, answered the lady's anxious question, assuring her that everything was fine and that nothing that was happening was worth worrying about, since the butler and maid were only busy with minor, unimportant matters. Squirrel listened carefully, feeling her heart clench with anxiety upon learning that the eldest gentleman of this house had developed a high fever and had lost consciousness again, unable to cope with the sudden illness. The lady, hiding her face behind a fan, said, with an expression of disappointment on her lips, how tired she was of her second child. Her voice sounded even, but there was a sense of weariness from everyday worries and detachment from what was happening. Her red, indifferent eyes were cold and impartial, as she asked, without showing the slightest emotion, whether the second gentleman had died. Her tone was so indifferent that it seemed she did not care about the fate of others. The servants replied that the master was still alive, but at that moment the boy, feeling his arm go numb, released his pet onto the table next to the cage, allowing him to rest, as he too needed a break after a long wait. The baby beast leaped gracefully to the surface when the mistress ordered that no food be served to the eldest son, allowing him to rest as if it were part of her carefully planned daily routine. Silently, the animal carefully followed the conversation between mother and son, observing how they behaved with restraint and cordially with each other, showing no signs of tension, as if there was nothing unnecessary between them. The noblewoman turned to the boy with a gentle smile, as if his presence warmed her heart, but in her eyes turned to the family's second child. A cold cruelty and obvious hatred burned, which was clearly not hidden from the gaze of those around her. The little squirrel was deeply worried about the health of the only person imprisoned in the tower. His little heart was filled with anxiety, and he could not get rid of thoughts about what could happen to this important person. The pet, staring at the many nuts located nearby, with an obvious desire to have a snack, noticed there were also pistachios, acorns, and other delicacies that could satisfy his hunger, but thoughts of something else still did not leave him. Squirrel was wildly angry when Tizen again called her a slave and ordered her to demonstrate a few tricks. Her pride was offended, and internal indignation boiled, but she tried not to show her emotions right away. When the pet refused to follow his instructions, Tizen, threateningly clenching his fists, said that if the squirrel did not obey, he would have to train it himself, which terrified the baby, and he trembled with fear. Feeling the chill of fear gripping him, the tired animal, curled up on the pillow, pretended to be asleep, hoping for rest, but this did not particularly please the nobleman, who watched his passive behavior with irritation, not realizing that his pet was feeling tired. Quite quickly, Tizen lost interest in his pet, concluding that the squirrel seemed to be completely useless and of no use, so his patience began to wear thin, and he began to ignore its behavior. Evening had come, the night had enveloped the world in its darkness, and the full moon illuminated the star-studded sky, creating an atmosphere of calm and mystery, as if the night itself was preparing for something important. The animal did not think long before deciding to escape from his master's room with a nut in his teeth to visit his brother in the tower, hoping that no one would notice his disappearance and he would be able to complete his secret mission. Once free, the little boy smiled broadly, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs, and the street before him opened up like an endless path full of possibilities, setting him up for a decisive and firm step towards his goal. The squirrel began to climb the roof, its small paws moving confidently upward, as if there was no obstacle that could stop it in this endeavor, and each movement seemed like a step towards freedom. After this, the pet continued to climb the wall, not knowing whether he should rejoice at his success or be sad, because his body was the body of an animal and could not be fully comprehended as a human one full of worries and experiences. The animal soon reached the right place, noticing a light shining softly into the dark corridor through a crack in the door. It peered inside cautiously, trying to be as quiet as possible so as not to attract attention. Inside by the window, on a bed in the chambers, sat a boy bent over in pain, clutching his chest with his hands, as if every cell in his body was screaming in fear and torment, and in his eyes, one could read the hopelessness of what was happening. The young man had a fever. His body was overcome with a feeling of pain. He closed his eyes, pressing his hands to his chest, and on his face, you could see how he was getting worse, as if the whole world around him was dissolving in unbearable suffering. When the handsome young man noticed that he had a little guest in his room, his gaze instantly froze, and his eyes, large and bright, filled with surprise, and he could not help but be surprised to see such a cute little animal with dark hair. The chipmunk, as if nothing had happened, smiled at the boy, winked at him, and slightly raising his little paw, waved it up in a welcoming manner, as if he did not notice at all the surprise that his unexpected appearance caused. The boy, looking at the animal in bewilderment, could not understand what it was doing in the window at night, at such a great height, and his heart began to beat faster from surprise and confusion. What brought this little animal here in the middle of the night? Without thinking twice, the boy stood up and leaned against the glass, trying to get a closer look at his pet. His surprise and shock were obvious because he could not understand how this animal ended up here in his room at such a time. The squirrel began to actively wave his little paws to the sides, as if begging to be led inside, where he could find protection from the night silence and cold air in a cozy and safe corner that promised warmth and peace. However, when the boy opened the window too quickly, the little animal did not have time to get its bearings, and losing its balance, almost fell, grabbing the window frame in panic, trying to regain control of itself and not fall into the dark abyss. Fear gripped the small creature, and its body shook as it began to stagger, feeling the enormous height beneath it become mortally dangerous, threatening a fall into the void that could be its last. The young man, possessing quick reflexes, did not lose his composure and grabbed the squirrel tightly with his hand, not allowing it to fall confidently, holding it at a safe height, although he himself felt the tension from how everything had happened. The boy's eyes widened, and he immediately apologized to his pet, realizing how careless he had been and how just one misstep could have led to disaster. The pet felt a profound sense of unease, realizing how close tragedy had come. The squirrel, feeling both strength and care in the boy's arms, could not hold back his tears, trembling from the fear he had experienced. He still could not believe that he had almost ended up in another world, where his fate could have been tragically different. When the pet finally calmed down, he suddenly realized that in front of him stood a young man with enormous magical potential who literally radiated power hidden behind his young and not yet fully revealed appearance. Completely astonished and confused, the squirrel couldn't tear his gaze away from the aristocrat, a young man surrounded by a magical aura. The power was so palpable that the energy itself made him feel afraid, as if the force could consume him. Taking a step forward, the squirrel extended its small paw upward, as if trying to calm the young man, who, despite his strength, had become nervous, not knowing how to cope with what had just unfolded before him. The nobleman looked in amazement at the animal, which stood frozen, its paws raised, as if unconsciously asking for a hug. Its eyes were filled with bewilderment, as such a touching request was completely unexpected. Suddenly, the baby, seemingly to express concern, gently touched the boy's nose with its paw. This gesture shocked the young man, who could not believe how such a small creature could be so gentle and sweet. Sitting near the open window, the boy suddenly realized that, thanks to this gentle touch, his magical power began to calm down, and the painful sensations that tormented him went away, leaving only lightness and peace. The wind was strong and blew straight into his face, yet his eyes were closed, and his breathing was even and calm, as if he was in complete harmony with the world around him, enjoying the silence and coolness. The nobleman was distinguished not only by his intelligence, but also by his keen perception, and therefore he immediately realized that the squirrel he saw was a magical creature, and most likely belonged to his brother. but for some reason, this little one ended up in his room. The young man instantly blushed with embarrassment, for he had forgotten that the little creature could not answer him or understand human speech, and this upset him a little, but he could not help but smile from the feeling of awkwardness. The pet, sighing heavily, stood up and looked closely at his interlocutor, who seemed incredibly sweet and not at all malicious, which contrasted with the behavior of his relatives, who had a more aggressive character. This sweet Johann, always smiling kindly, was not only a good guy, but also the main character of the novel, whose kindness and sincerity constantly attracted the attention of everyone around him, creating an atmosphere of warmth and trust. When the boy was still a child, a tragedy occurred. His biological mother passed away, leaving him an orphan, and this moment remained forever in his memory as the most painful event of his early childhood. Then the Duke, his guardian, married again, and the new wife quickly became pregnant, which brought a new wave of emotions into the house, but also the inner experiences of Johann himself, who was faced with changes in his life. After some time, the Duke went to war, to a difficult battle, and his departure to the front became a great test for everyone because the future of the family was now tied to what would happen in these brutal battles. And so the protagonist was left alone in this loneliness in which he so desperately needed support, but alas, did not receive it. His heart was tormented by an inner emptiness, and with each passing day, he felt more and more how hard his fate was. When the future Duke turned 10 years old, his life changed. He began to experience magical attacks. His strength grew, but with it came an unbearable pain that squeezed his chest, leaving him in a constant struggle with himself and his body. The Duchess, his new cruel mother, was not at all pleased with the fact that the boy would grow up to be a powerful wizard. She could not accept the fact that he could become the best, surpass her own son, and take the place she so desperately tried to preserve for him. And then Johann found himself locked in the tower, under the pretext that it would be better for himself, although he felt how this isolation from the world was destroying his soul and strength more and more every day, forcing him to feel loneliness on a deep level. The boy grew up in complete isolation, without society or friends, surrounded only by cold walls and empty days. An evil lady planning her own gain intended to use him as a weapon and send him to the battlefield when he grew up. 5 years later, according to the novel's plot, Johann will become not only a strong warrior, but also a great fighter who will end the war. However, despite his victory, he will turn into a villain who lost the bright part of his soul on the path to power. The book's true tragedy begins with the young man's return. He returns with knightly armor, a cold heart, and a sword in his hand, unaware of how much he has to lose and how long the journey ahead will be. As a reward for his victory in the war, he will be given the gift of marriage to Princess Marielle, who will become his wife. She, mysterious and strong, is the main character of the novel, and her fate will intertwine with his forming a tragic alliance. At first sight, the young man, struck by her unearthly beauty and golden curls, falls madly in love and passionately strives to win her heart, but all attempts are in vain. After all, the heart of this charming person has long and undividedly belonged to the crown prince of the kingdom. Johann, possessed by a blind and destructive passion for a woman who does not reciprocate his feelings, turns into a ruthless antagonist, ready to commit any, even the darkest actions, just to break fate and connect his life with his beloved. The little squirrel, looking with sincere admiration at the kind and affectionate child, could not even imagine that one day this bright image would be replaced by cruelty, and that before him would appear a stern tyrant driven by cold calculation and merciless force. Folding his hands in front of his furry friend, the boy hesitantly but sincerely whispered that it was surprisingly pleasant for him to touch the warm fur, because with each touch, the pain seemed to dissolve, leaving behind only lightness and peace. After a moment's hesitation, he timidly asked if the little animal would allow him to enjoy this moment a little longer if it didn't mind, and upon hearing the gentle consent, his face lit up with a quiet, almost childish joy, as if at that moment the whole world had become kinder and warmer. Johann, still embarrassed, but genuinely happy, thanked his little friend with warmth in his voice, feeling a gentle, subtle feeling of comfort spreading inside him, as if a ray of sunlight had penetrated his heart. With tenderness and caution, as if touching something precious, he again ran his fingers over the soft fur of the animal, enjoying every movement, every touch of this living, warm creature. For the first time in many years spent in the cold solitude of the gloomy tower, someone finally came to him, giving him at least a brief but incredibly long-awaited meeting that warmed his heart and dispelled the heavy silence. Just recently, the boy, overcome with hopelessness, lay on his bed, tormented by unbearable pain, both physical and mental, tormented by self-hatred, as if the entire weight of the world had fallen on his fragile shoulders. But as soon as the little squirrel approached him, the air around seemed to be filled with a light light, and in Johann's chest, where only darkness had previously reigned, a feeling of warmth and joy suddenly arose as if everything inside was filled with light. A happy smile played on the handsome man's lips. His gaze was filled with sincere gratitude, and the excitement from the emotions that overwhelmed him made him special. Flushed, he looked especially handsome and bright at that moment. The young man, filled with genuine joy, shone so brightly that the little squirrel instinctively covered itself with its paws, feeling its heart beat faster than usual, overcome by an excitement for which it itself could not find an explanation. The woman whose soul by the will of fate was trapped in the body of a tiny animal unexpectedly felt embarrassed, struck by how attractive and touching the young man looked, illuminated by happiness and childish spontaneity. Having recovered from the overwhelming emotions, Johann, slightly embarrassed, but trying to remain polite, timidly asked if his little guest could come to him again tomorrow to visit him again and brighten up his loneliness with a warm, kind meeting. Trying to hold back the tears that were treacherously welling up from sincere compassion for the lonely and unhappy aristocrat, the tiny animal silently nodded in agreement because deep down he understood how much he needed at least someone nearby. The young man, overflowing with gratitude, with a beaming smile, thanked his little companion again for his warm company, and at that moment his heart, accustomed to cold emptiness, suddenly filled with such rare but true happiness. Probably too many Fall's endless days of loneliness and inescapable pain made him a stranger even to himself, and over time he became wild, turning into that very cruel tyrant, as if he had stepped out of the pages of an old book. Wanting to warm the young man, at least a little, with his care and attention, the little animal, without thinking, handed him a small nut, like a modest but sincere gift, to someone who so desperately needed kindness. Johann, awkwardly pointing his finger at himself, as if not believing that this unexpected gesture was addressed specifically to him, asked with slight uncertainty in his voice whether the little boy had really decided to give this nut to him. Carefully and with special tenderness, taking the little animal in his arms, the young aristocrat looked at it with a warm smile, and with sincere gratitude thanked it for this modest but priceless gift which warmed his heart more than any jewelry. But then the moment of farewell came, and trying not to show a slight sadness, the nobleman gently told his tiny friend that he could always come to him whenever he wanted, because his visits brought joy that had not been seen in this gloomy tower for a long time. Before leaving, the squirrel, filled with a kind of affection, gracefully raised its paw, and a little embarrassed, but amicably waved goodbye to the young man, as if to make it clear that this meeting was far from the last. And then, without wasting a second, the nimble little animal took off and quickly rushed down the stone wall, disappearing into the darkness, and its fluffy tail amusingly swung from side to side, as if saying goodbye once again. Left alone, Johann thoughtfully tapped his fingers on the cold windowsill, as if thinking about something important that was bothering him, but this time his loneliness no longer seemed so unbearable. Looking out the window, the young man realized a simple yet terrifying truth. The only way to get rid of the inner pain that was tearing him apart was to take possession of his cousin's sacred creature and make it his own. A stately mansion with graceful architecture stood amidst greenery, its deep blue roof shimmering in the soft light of the new day, while manicured gardens spread around, filling the air with the scent of fresh foliage and flowers. A small squirrel, curled up comfortably on a soft pillow, dozed sweetly, tired after a long, restless night spent without sleep, while the muffled conversations of people could be heard around, filling the room with a warm, barely perceptible noise. At that moment, her owner, sitting nearby, was immersed in reading, holding in his hands an ancient book, the pages of which revealed secret knowledge about how to turn one's sacred animal into a human, revealing the boundaries between magic and reality. His eyes, red like burning coals, carefully ran over the lines, absorbing every word, until suddenly, among the notes, he came across an unexpected fact. It turned out that you could determine the sex of your pet by the shape and features of its fluffy tail. He grabbed the squirrel sharply by its fluffy tail, and without hesitation pulled it towards him roughly and unceremoniously, not caring about its sleep. He needed to figure out once and for all who he was holding in his arms, a boy or a girl. The squirrel hung helplessly in the air, its legs twitching, and its eyes flashed with anger at such a sudden and unpleasant awakening. It had not yet had time to realize what was happening, but it already felt irritated by the unceremonious way in which it had been treated. The pet froze in his arms as the nobleman, studying the pages of the book, suddenly realized that, judging by all the signs, his little companion must be a female. This unexpected conclusion puzzled him, forcing him to wonder what he truly wanted from his pet. Frowning, the boy muttered something irritably under his breath, wondering with undisguised disgust how old his pet was. He had wanted a reliable companion, a loyal friend, not a girl, and this thought filled him with a strange disappointment. Finally, with a heavy sigh as if discarding an unnecessary thing, he unclenched his fingers, allowing the little animal to plop back down onto the soft pillow, not even bothering to apologize for his rudeness. Thinking to herself about how kind and caring Johann was, and involuntarily comparing him with his brother, the squirrel came to the conclusion that she would like it to be the eldest son who became her master because he was much more attentive and patient. That is why the little animal, despite its natural inclination towards independence, decided to help the young man, hoping that being near him, he would not find himself in the small but important request that she would one day leave him. Hugging the little nut with his tiny paws, the pet suddenly felt a strange heaviness in his chest because he had to come to terms with the thought that long days would pass, waiting for him to get rid of his constant food, only acorns. With hatred, almost desperation, the squirrel threw the nut far away from itself, as if trying to get rid of the hateful reminder of how it had to live and that its life was stuck in one endless cycle of eating only acorns. After this, the baby, tired from everything that had happened, curled up on the pillow, wanting to rest and take a nap, feeling how his body needed rest and restoration because he was incredibly exhausted after a long day. Night had fallen upon the earth once again, and a special silence hung in the air. The full moon illuminated the darkness, and the darkness as always hid everything that was hidden from human sight, giving everything around a special mystery. The young man held a nut in his hand, and he carefully examined it in the darkness, trying to discern every detail on its smooth shell, while the stars in the sky, like silent witnesses to his thoughts, twinkled around him, creating an atmosphere of solitude and peace. Johann sat by the window, looking into the distance, waiting for the arrival of his new little friend. His heart was full of hope and impatience, but with each passing moment, anxiety grew in his soul, the thought that the chipmunk might not return, never leaving him. He thought about his pet, about how strange and mysterious he was, and he could not get rid of doubts about whether he would come back or whether this little friend would forever remain in his memory, and with him the sadness of separation. He squeezed the nut sharply with his fingers, as if trying to calm himself with this simple but effective gesture, and felt his tense body relax a little, despite the inner restless tremor. Suddenly, Johann shuddered. His attention was drawn to a strange noise, as if someone was carefully scratching the wall, as if an invisible animal was trying to get inside the room, causing his heart to beat faster in surprise. Suddenly, a small pet paw appeared in front of him, carefully and deftly, making its way along the windowsill as if overcoming invisible obstacles, and was about to climb onto the windowsill, bringing a bit of lively energy into the room. And finally, the squirrel's head appeared, its determined gaze and red cheeks giving it an incredible cuteness, as if this small furry creature, despite its fragility, was full of determination and independence, causing a warm feeling of affection in the young man. The nobleman's eyes lit up with joy, and such a sincere smile appeared on his face that it was clear that he was immensely happy to see his little friend, who had returned to him like a messenger of long-awaited hope. The boy was all aglow with innocence and pure delight, as if there was not the slightest shadow of doubt in his soul, and he greeted the squirrel with joy, happily waving his fingers, as if inviting her to be near him again. Quietly and carefully, with exquisite care, he extended his hand towards the animal, inviting it to sit on his palm, thereby creating a feeling of safety and warmth, as if offering the squirrel a space where it could feel completely safe. When the squirrel easily moved onto his hand, Johann carefully asked if it was dangerous to travel so far at night because he was worried about his little companion, not even realizing how attached he had become to him during this time. After which, the young man, without hiding his concern, went to his bed, offering the little animal a little rest in his cozy bed, as if he was ready to provide his little friend with everything he could require for peace and comfort at this late hour. The little animal sat down on the soft sheet. His small eyes seemed about to fill with tears of tenderness and gratitude because he was struck by such unexpected kindness on the part of the second eldest gentleman of this house, who showed concern without any expectations. In response, the squirrel, feeling how cozy and calm she was next to him, invited the nobleman to sit down and also rest, as if saying that this moment deserved to be shared because it was important and cozy for her. The young man, a little embarrassed, but touched by this offer, sat down next to her, with a slight blush, accepting the invitation to take a place on the edge of the bed, not wanting to disturb the intimacy of this moment, but still wanting to be close to his little friend. When Johann had completely laid down the animal, sensing his fatigue, touched him with its paw, and used magic to remove all the pain that tormented his body. With each moment that the magic absorbed the suffering, the boy felt his body fill with relief. Smiling, the young man spoke with gratitude about how he had thought for a long time about what name to give his little friend, and had even come up with several options, hoping that at least one of them would be suitable for such an amazing creature. Having received the squirrel's permission, the young man enthusiastically began suggesting various names, believing that each option might be the one his pet would like. He was full of enthusiasm and hope that the name would become an important part of their bond. However, none of the suggested names pleased the squirrel, who frowned, as if she already knew that all of these options were completely inappropriate, terrible, and even a little stupid, which made her feel dissatisfied and disappointed. Johann was a little disappointed when he couldn't please the pet and choose a name for it, because he tried so hard to do everything right and truly guess what would be close and beloved by the animal. His face darkened with disappointment, but he still did not lose hope. The little animal shrank back in embarrassment from the young man's sweet appearance, a blush appearing on her face. She felt awkward, as if she herself had not expected such excessive attention and care, and her reaction only emphasized her invisible modesty. With tears in his eyes, Johann promised that the next time they met again, he would definitely come up with a better name that would perfectly suit her character, and his words were sincere, full of determination and hope for a better future for their relationship. However, despite all his efforts and attention, the pet absorbed so much magical energy that it soon became overflowing, like a glass that could never be filled anymore. And this, of course, was not the best condition for its health. Not wanting to tire himself out any further, the squirrel carefully moved his little paw away from the boy's forehead and began to carefully observe his peacefully dozing, truly beautiful appearance, feeling some satisfaction from the work he had done. The animal was quite pleased with the result of its efforts, and stretching discreetly wiped the sweat from its forehead, feeling a slight pride in its own care for the sleeping man, and continued to monitor his calm state. However, something strange soon began to happen, which caused alarm. The boy felt unusual changes and began to slowly open his eyes, feeling a mysterious light emanating from his little friend, who was previously a squirrel. The boy stood up suddenly, his eyes wide and completely confused, trying to comprehend what was happening and how it could be connected to his little friend, who had suddenly become something completely different. In front of him stood a little girl with blonde hair and huge eyes, and where the squirrel had been, now stood this wonderful, completely unusual pretty girl, looking both surprised and delightfully beautiful at the same time. 1. The little girl froze in confusion, blushing slightly, and whispering something under her breath, trying to justify her unusual transformation and figure out what was happening, feeling the surprised young man's gaze on her. Joyfully realizing that she had turned into a human again, the squirrel felt genuine joy that literally shone in her eyes, and she looked at the young man with bated breath, realizing that something amazing had happened. As soon as the soft blanket wrapped around her to cover her naked body, the baby felt the comfort and warmth return, giving her a sense of security in this new form. Johann, who was sitting nearby and watching everything that was happening, blushed with awkwardness, leaned over slightly, and quietly remarked that the girl perhaps should cover herself up to avoid unnecessary embarrassment in front of the guy. The girl smiled gratefully, sensing the sincere concern of her interlocutor, and thanked him for his attention, realizing how important it is sometimes to show care and attention to others, even when it comes to such unexpected situations. The magic suddenly began to swirl around the little girl again, creating a glow around her, as she tried to explain that sometimes a sacred being could temporarily take on human form and that it was part of her nature. However, she didn't have time to finish, because suddenly the magic stopped, and as if on instant command, she turned into a squirrel again, feeling how her human form disappeared, and with it all her strength. The little girl was deeply confused and frightened, feeling terrified when she realized that she had become a squirrel again, unable to speak or explain her experiences, which left her completely isolated from those around her. In the library near the bookcase, a conversation began about how sacred beasts, having accumulated a sufficient amount of magic, could often take on human form, and this phenomenon was quite rare and amazing. The boy continued to absorb knowledge from books that explained in detail everything related to magic, striving to learn as much as possible about the nature of magic and its application, despite the difficulties and difficult questions. Tezen sat with a book in his hands, which stated that if anyone ever became human, they would have to wait several days to return to their normal form. Squirrel sitting nearby looked upset and a little worried. The young man clutched his head in irritation, realizing that he would have to wait a full 50 days before his pet could become human again. This wait seemed endless to him, and his anxiety only grew. Teason looked sternly at the squirrel, instructing her to keep track of the dates and remind him of them, since she must now take responsibility for everything that concerned this long period of waiting. Nevertheless, the animal carefully remembered everything the young man read about how to turn an animal into a human, delving into every word, because his fate depended on this knowledge, and he was ready to do everything to become a human. Once again, Teason couldn't help but notice how lucky the squirrel was to have her master, for he was a powerful magician, and it was thanks to this that she, as his devoted servant, was fortunate to experience many adventures in this magical world. The little animal settled comfortably, sorting through the nuts in front of him, enjoying the moment of peace and quiet, while his thoughts were occupied with something more important than just food, and he was looking for ways to find his freedom in this world. The little boy picked up the food, looking thoughtfully at the young man next to him, and suddenly an unusual and interesting idea came to him, which he could not immediately push away, because it seemed so unusual that it was worth thinking about right away. Johann watched his friend with surprise, his eyes filled with bewilderment and curiosity, because he did not expect such a turn of events, and every action of his friend seemed more and more mysterious and unusual to him. The chipmunk's bag contained a strange note, which he carefully took with him, unaware of its importance, and now it has become the key to solving all those mysterious events that were just beginning. The nobleman took the suspicious paper into his hands and carefully began to unfold it, feeling a strange premonition come over him, because the letter looked as if it belonged to someone very important, whose name was hidden behind the mysterious signs. However, after a few moments, the aristocrat realized that in front of him was not a whole book, but only a torn-out page, which clearly should not have ended up in his hands, and this discovery left him in a state of slight confusion. The handsome man, in complete shock, asked his pet what he had brought him, and the squirrel answered him with a slight nod, as if confirming that it was she who had chosen this path, and her agreement only strengthened the strange feeling in her owner. So the little animal decided it was time to learn to communicate using body language, so that a real connection could be created between him and the person, and he could convey his thoughts without words, making their relationship even more extraordinary. The boy, a little surprised, asked in bewilderment whether the squirrel was really a sacred animal, because after such behavior, his doubts began to grow, and he began to be increasingly surprised by the unusual actions of his pet. The little boy, pretending to be reading the book attentively, became lost in thought at that moment, and Johann realized that the animal wanted him to read the ancient message it had brought, since this particular page apparently contained important information. As soon as the little one made an angry face, trying to portray the boy's cousin, who was so cruel and bad, his expression became so convincing that Johann could not help but notice how skillfully this animal played his role, causing surprise. Johann finally realized that the paper had been stolen from his relative's library, and he realized that the squirrel actually wanted his friend to study the sacred animals in more detail, because this knowledge could be the key to the mystery. Suddenly, the animal jumped onto the shoulder of the embarrassed young man, joyfully expressing its gratitude that the aristocrat turned out to be so quick-witted and intelligent, and his actions only emphasized how correctly he understood everything that was happening. Johann felt a little embarrassed when he realized that the little one was praising him, but instead of objecting, he simply accepted the praise with a small smile, not used to such attention from his pet. After reading the page, the young man learned that if his pet fed on its owner's magic for 50 days, it would be able to transform into a human, and this discovery made him think about the further development of their unusual union. The girl the handsome man saw was surprisingly sweet. Her big innocent eyes shone with light, and her curly hair playfully touched her shoulders, creating an image that could not be forgotten, and her invisible but strong attractiveness struck him. Johann blushed, his cheeks flushed, as he thought of that little girl, and his thoughts could not leave her image. He really wanted to see her again, because something in her charm was unusually attractive to him. So he spent the whole night at his desk, absorbed in his studies, with the squirrel nestled comfortably on his shoulder, quietly watching his actions like an invisible companion, and his thoughts completely occupied with the task, while time flew by. Tizen, returning to his quarters, screamed in horror when he saw the complete disarray on his table. Books were scattered around, and an atmosphere of panic hung in the air, as if chaos itself had come into his home, making him feel insecure and confused. There was a book of spells lying there, but the pages had been torn out, and the rest of the book was covered in strange patterns that seemed completely unfamiliar, as if someone had deliberately tried to hide its true contents, leaving only mysterious signs. The boy turned to his sacred beast, pointing his finger at the book, and asking if he knew anything about what had happened to the book, since its strange state suggested that something strange was going on around it. The young man stood next to the closet, trying to understand whether some magical spirits or forces had appeared in the room that had disturbed its peace, and he examined every corner, trying to catch something unusual that could explain the strange events happening in his life. Clutching his head, he searched in panic for the missing pages, but despite all his efforts, he could not find them, and the feeling of helplessness grew until he realized that something very important was escaping his attention. The little animal, tired after a long day, dozed off on a soft pillow, his small body trembling slightly from dreams, and the calm in the room contrasted with his inner world full of secrets and experiences. It was raining outside, the drops loudly hitting the glass, as if time was slowing down, and this sound seemed to be the only thing that broke the silence, creating the feeling that the whole world was plunging into a deep and peaceful sleep. The bad weather, rain, and clouds that covered the sky gave the mansion a gloomy and menacing appearance, as if the house itself was on the verge of revealing its dark side, hiding everything that was happening inside. Tizen was glad that the weather was not too fine, and looking out the window, a slight smile appeared on his face, as if this gray and rainy day suited his mood, creating a special feeling of satisfaction. Suddenly, the aristocrat seized his pet, acting with such swiftness and determination. All his movements were quick and confident, as if this moment had been carefully planned in advance. Tizen grinned, his face filling with a sinister grin, as he held his pet close, his gaze filled with a sinister secret, and his eyes glowed, as if he was about to reveal something amazing and unusual. The little animal turned away in disappointment. He was angered by how the master spoke to him so rudely, as if he were no better than an ordinary animal, and this irritation only increased with each of his careless gestures, not noticing his emotions. Suddenly, a terrible sight appeared on the street. Johann was walking in the rain, hugging himself with his arms and shivering with cold. Maids followed him with umbrellas, but the boy had nothing that could protect him from the rain. The young man looked like a wet mouse shivering from the cold. His eyes were empty and cold, but despite this, he continued to stubbornly move forward, as if not noticing either fatigue or pain, following the orders of his evil stepmother. Tizen, with a mocking smile, pointed to his foolish cousin, who, despite the terrible weather, continued to walk. Hatred hung between them, as if his existence was another test for everyone around him, and that look was full of contempt. The little animal screamed indignantly as he felt his master's hand squeeze his own, and he was angry at how badly they treated the poor handsome fellow, forcing him to suffer in the cold rain, despite his sincere nature. With an evil laugh, Tizen loudly declared that this was exactly the medicine the doctor had prescribed for his cousin, walking in the rain while his words were full of contempt, as if his cousin deserved such a cruel fate. The maids continued to stubbornly lead the boy forward. Despite his exhausted strength and complete impotence, he was wet, cold, and incredibly tired, and every step he took was difficult, as if his body no longer yielded to his will. The little animal, looking at what was happening, could not contain his horror and pain watching the aristocrat. His heart was filled with sympathy and pity for the poor boy who seemed doomed, and he felt every one of his sufferings as his own. Suddenly, with a slight movement, Tezen threw the squirrel aside loudly, declaring that he himself would like to be part of this treatment of his cousin, but in fact his words were filled with cruel mockery, as if he enjoyed torturings. The pet, clenching his teeth in anger, sank onto the table, watching his master's departure with contempt and malice. He could not understand how anyone could be so cruel, mocking his poor cousin, and his heart filled with ever greater hatred. The squirrel, deciding to take decisive action, stuffed himself with as many nuts as he could, broke through the window, and quickly burst outside. He felt like a hero taking this bold step, despite its strangeness and senselessness in the eyes of those around him. The squirrel was determined to save the poor aristocrat, her friend, and help him despite all the difficulties. She could not allow him to get into trouble, and did everything possible to get him out. At this time, Ella stood near the window, carefully observing what was happening on the street, while she was wearing an elegant sage scarf as well as a delicate green dress that emphasized her refined grace and excellent taste. Behind her stood the doctor she had approached for help. He listened carefully and reported that her eldest son's health was somehow improving, although Ella herself was not particularly interested in his recovery. Frowning fiercely, the lady asked the doctor if he knew exactly how to treat the Duke's son, as if she doubted his professionalism, although her gaze was cold and her words were full of discontent and suspicion. The doctor bowed low and apologized to the lady, explaining that the boy's improvement in health was only temporary, as hypothermia could actually serve as a kind of cure for a magician, and promised to be more attentive. The rain continued to fall outside the window, its monotonous sound, as if lulling, filling the space, while the palace sank into a gray abyss, as if hidden behind a veil of thick clouds radiating cold and gloom. The man said in a calm, confident tone that if Johann continued to wander in the rain, his condition would inevitably worsen. His skin would turn pale, he would feel weak and painful again, as if he were returning to his previous painful problems. The noblewoman, smiling reservedly, thanked the doctor for his help, while gently reminding him of the need to be more attentive to the Duke's health, since his condition directly affected the well-being of the entire family. The beauty thought to herself how much Johann was an unpleasant thorn in her side, how she hated him with all her heart, unable to hide her dislike for this boy, who in her opinion invariably prevented her from achieving her goals. Upon learning that this boy possessed a rare talent for magic, Ella without hesitation immediately decided to get rid of him, feeling that his presence could become a threat to her ambitions for power and control over the situation in the family. However, before she could take the decisive step, she began to notice how the nobles began to whisper behind her back, wondering what would happen if the heir of the family disappeared. This called into question her own actions and caused discontent among the upper classes of society. Clenching her fingers into a fist, the lady mentally returned to the moment when she could not get rid of the young man, and remembered that it was all about the military oath that she took, being under obligations, unable to break it, even if she wanted to. This oath was made in a formal treaty between her family and the imperial dynasty, and despite her personal desires, she could not go against this agreement, knowing that the consequences could be devastating. In fact, this was a carefully concealed secret plan of the ruler of the empire, who, fearing the strengthening of aristocratic power, sought to maintain the balance of power and control any attempts by the noble family to assert its dominance in politics. The main head of a noble family, known for his bravery and strength, took part in the war, fighting in full armor, holding a sword in his hands, which symbolized his status and determination to fight until his last breath. In the event of his death, his heirs were to immediately enter the fray in his place, to continue waging war, upholding the family's honor, and following the strict traditions laid down in the family code. Not wanting her own son to be forced to go to the battlefield, Ella decided to save the boy's life, considering him her only chance in the future, because his fate was inseparable from the war, and she had to prepare him for this inevitable fate. Watching the boy, soaked to the bone by the pouring rain, suffer from deteriorating health, the noblewoman, without showing her feelings, ordered him to thank her for saving his miserable life, since it was only thanks to her mercy that he remained alive. Johann desperately tried to resist the maids, barely keeping himself on his feet, trying to say that he was losing consciousness. He was so cold and wet, and he could no longer go further, feeling his strength leaving him. However, the maid, without showing a drop of sympathy, said dryly and indifferently that the boy should not whine because they still had a long way to go, and they would not stop despite his complaints and weakness. Sitting in a nearby tree, the squirrel sadly watched the scene where Johann was suffering, unable to help him, but her gaze was full of sympathy and concern because she understood that he had a lot to go through. She sat quietly, silently, waiting, and scattered all the nuts she had brought with her on the tree bark in front of her, as if trying to find some solace in somehow lightening her soul while watching the boy's misfortune. Determined, the squirrel mentally promised herself not to give up, and firmly grasping the nut in her paw, she took aim at the evil maids who were tormenting her friend, preparing to strike to somehow influence the situation. With great effort, she threw the nut, which flew with such force that its trajectory was full of malice and hostility, conveying all the rage she felt towards these cruel people who were treating Johann so insensitively. The maids screamed loudly in unexpected pain and horror, not understanding what exactly had happened because they had not had time to see anything when something strange and unexpected hit them, causing them to stagger in shock. Johann stood in complete shock as he watched the maids fall to the ground, clutching their heads in disbelief, completely unable to comprehend what was happening. He was so confused that he couldn't comprehend what exactly could have shaken these people so much. However, when his gaze accidentally fell on the ground, he noticed a nut among the stones, and only at that moment did it dawn on him that it was this small and unremarkable object that was the cause of everything that had happened, causing them to experience such pain and surprise. The young man's gaze lingered on the acorn lying among the stones, and he suddenly realized who could help him. A guess surfaced in his thoughts, and the raindrops continued to fall on his hair, as if trying to distract him from the important thought. In the distance, among the dense trees, he noticed a squirrel, which, with an expression of alarm on its face, was screaming something desperately, trying to get his attention, and at that moment, the charming young man realized that the animal wanted to convey an important warning to him. Quickly realizing that the little animal was calling him to action, not inaction, the aristocrat realized that its cry meant only one thing: it was time to run while there was still a chance and not waste precious time, which could be decisive. Without wasting time to think, Johann quickly stepped forward, not wanting to stay in the pouring rain any longer, trying to somehow escape from the cold drops and feel safe at least for a moment. Hiding among the dense bushes and fallen leaves, the little animal watched attentively as the nobleman, confidently stepping towards the closed doors, finally disappeared behind them, heading home, leaving all his worries behind. Wiping the sweat from her muzzle, the squirrel watched with a slight sense of satisfaction as she, despite all the difficulties, managed to help the boy at such a crucial moment. A bright feeling of pride flared in her thoughts that she had not let him down when it was needed. Sitting on a tree branch, she watched the events unfolding with interest and attention, thinking about how pleasant it would be to return to her cozy chambers, where she would be surrounded by peace and safety, far from all this nervous and stormy atmosphere. But suddenly, like a bolt from the blue, the little animal shuddered, hearing a rough, strange voice, which, with obvious irritation, asked where Johann had gone, and this increased his wariness. It was Tizen, as evil as the devil himself, standing with an umbrella and a bucket of water in his hands, intending to play a joke on his cousin by pouring all the water on him, but to his annoyance, he managed to run away, and now the boy furiously scolded the maids for not being able to stop him. Instead of accepting defeat, the boy, in a fit of rage, poured water on the maids, who, not expecting such a turn of events, squealed in fear, feeling how the icy water, like a frosty stream, penetrated their bodies, causing them to shiver with cold. The boy was suddenly taken by surprise when his mother, who had quietly approached from behind, suddenly stopped him, and he started with fear before he even had time to realize that she had appeared, despite his readiness to continue. The lady calmly placed her hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him down and relieve the tension, as he, with a displeased expression, explained that he had only wanted to make fun of his cousin, not realizing how inappropriate his actions were at that moment. The noblewoman reminded her son that his actions were not an entertaining joke, but part of the obligatory treatment for his relative, and urged him to behave more restrained and respectful in such a situation. After these words, she clarified that, although Tizen might have experienced some disappointment, it did not cause him deep sadness, because there would still be many opportunities ahead to visit his brother, find a common language with him, and strengthen their relationship if such a desire arose. Tizin, feeling relieved, nodded with a slight smile, allowing the tension to leave his thoughts, and then turned to his mother, and overcome with genuine curiosity, asked if he should expect guests tomorrow, anticipating the answer with interest. The lady nodded in agreement and announced that the Duchess of Medest and her daughter would be visiting them tomorrow. Upon hearing these names, the squirrel gave a slight shudder, instantly recognizing them and realizing what event lay ahead. After all, that very daughter turned out to be the main character, a charming girl with golden hair like sunbeams, adorned with a sky-blue bow, which gave her appearance even more refined elegance. The animal shuddered again, but this time not only from fear, but also from the realization that at this very moment, at this point in their destiny, a meeting would take place that could change the lives of the two main characters so much that the past would lose all meaning. The little animal couldn't stop trembling because he knew perfectly well that the meeting between the two most important characters was supposed to take place only at the end of the story, when the long years of war would be behind him. But something went wrong. Time had compressed, and now the inevitable would happen much sooner than he thought. However, circumstances changed, as did the fates of the heroes, because Johann, unlike his brother, was a modest boy, accustomed to keeping in the shadows, and although he was always portrayed as a disgrace to the family, he never complained, preferring to silently endure the contempt of those around him. Squirrel could hardly contain her rage as she looked at this smug, hypocritical family, who without any hesitation openly hated the Duke's eldest son, as if he were not a family member to them, but a useless burden that they dreamed of getting rid of at any cost. Suddenly, Ella, as if deliberately choosing the moment, began to talk about how tomorrow her beloved son would demonstrate his magical abilities to those around him, and therefore he should definitely take the sacred animal with him. The little animal shuddered in horror, realizing that tomorrow he would have to take part in a mysterious ritual, the meaning and consequences of which remained unclear to him, but he knew one thing for sure: after this event, his life would never be the same. Night had come into its own, enveloping the world in thick darkness, and in this cold, disturbing silence, three silhouettes stood out in particular: a high tower, majestic but ominous, a gloomy sky covered with clouds, and an old mansion that seemed empty. Johann felt worse and worse. The heat burned his face, his breathing became ragged, his heart beat unevenly, and therefore, hoping for relief, he opened the window with difficulty, letting fresh air into the room, but even the icy wind burning his skin could not relieve the fever. After a long rain that had been pouring since early morning, Johann was soaking wet, and by evening his health had deteriorated so much that his legs could no longer support him. The world began to swim before his eyes, and a moment later, exhausted, he collapsed onto the cold floor. He clutched the acorn in his fingers, which he had been keeping for several days, because he was waiting for the appearance of his little friend, the squirrel that always came to him, and at that moment he suddenly caught himself thinking that he regretted his original intention to use the animal for revenge on the duchy. His family, like a graceful but lonely rose, seemed forever cursed by an inevitable loneliness, where each new descendant was born not to happiness and love, but to feel again and again the cold touch of fate, doomed to isolation. But after long conversations with the squirrel, after many meetings that happened day after day, Johann unexpectedly realized that he could no longer see this animal as just a tool for revenge, because something more had grown between them: trust. The chipmunk, who had initially only watched him with caution, soon stopped being afraid, and then even began to come to him regularly, greeting the young man with his usual curious gaze, and Johann, who had previously always been gloomy, now involuntarily smiled. When the gloomy sky burst into torrential rain, and the evil maids, inspired by their impunity, furiously chased the aristocrat, hoping to corner him and teach him a lesson for his insolence, suddenly out of nowhere, a brave little animal appeared and rushed at the offenders. The squirrel, as before, came only at night, as if he knew that it was at this time that Johann especially needed someone's presence, and now he was sitting on the windowsill again, looking thoughtfully at his friend, his tiny eyes shining with anxiety. A moment later, the little animal nimbly jumped from the window straight onto the young man's shoulder. Its warm fur pleasantly touched his cheek, and then Johann, feeling the joy of the long-awaited meeting, exhaled with relief, smiled, and said that his little friend had finally returned. The handsome man, still remembering the recent incident when the little animal saved him from his pursuers, looked at his little friend with gratitude, but before he could say a word, a sudden violent coughing fit pierced his chest, causing his body to shudder. The squirrel, sensing something was wrong, began to thrash anxiously on his shoulder, then carefully moved closer, pressing its soft paws against his neck, as if trying to make sure that its friend was still conscious, since he looked too pale, like a shadow of himself. Johann, despite the weakness that had overcome him, felt the warm touch of soft wool on his cheek. He caught the care in this movement, and a barely noticeable smile touched his lips, because he knew that the creature possessing power was again taking away the excess magic from him, thereby helping. When the fever finally subsided and his body stopped burning with heat, the exhausted young man was able to take a deep breath, feeling relief. And it was at that moment that the squirrel, having completed its work, settled down on the soft sheet next to him, curled up into a ball, and quietly exhaled. The boy looked too bad, especially for the heir of such a powerful family, whose blood should have boiled with strength, not weakness. But the illness had been wearing him down since childhood, and now that his body was weakened, he could only watch as the restless little animal remained nearby. The little animal carefully placed one paw on its forehead, as if trying to imitate the gesture of people, and narrowed its eyes thoughtfully, assessing the condition of its friend, sincerely worried about his health, because Johann looked exhausted, and weakness still constrained his movements. It was at that moment that an unexpected idea came to the little creature's mind: to stay close, warming the young man with his own warmth, and thereby help him heal, since his magic had the ability to draw out pain and restore strength. Johann, catching the slight movement of the animal, suddenly decided that it was going to leave, and deep down this thought caused bitterness, because he did not want to be alone again. So he smiled weakly, and hiding his disappointment, asked why it was leaving him so early. The squirrel suddenly froze in place, her fluffy tail twitching slightly in surprise, because she had not intended to leave him for long. On the contrary, she had planned to disappear for a short time for his sake, and then return with renewed strength, but now she did not know how to explain this. Unable to tear her eyes away from how sick the aristocrat looked, the squirrel, feeling unbearable anxiety for his condition, approached him cautiously, as if silently asking him to open his arms so that she could come closer and calm him down. When the young man, still not understanding what was happening, finally extended his arms, the little animal, as if having received permission, quickly jumped into his arms, pressing its back against his palms and settling comfortably on them, as if intending to offer its strength to help. Johann, feeling how strange and absurd it all was, stared at the little animal, unable to understand what it wanted from him, because the whole situation seemed so unusual to him that his thoughts were confused and could not find an answer. The little animal, sensing his confusion, pointed its paw at its belly with incredible persistence, as if silently asking the boy to stroke it, and despite the strangeness of the gesture, Johann realized that the squirrel was in fact trying to comfort him, giving him a small but important attention. Slowly and carefully, with weak fingers, the young man began to stroke the animal's soft fur. His movements became gentle, as if he was afraid of doing something wrong, but despite this, the feeling of warmth and closeness calmed him, giving him some unfamiliar but pleasant emotions. Sitting on the bed amidst the silence and moonlight, Johann, unexpectedly for himself, quietly, almost ominously, spoke, continuing to caress the animal, as if convincing himself that it would be much better if this faithful and devoted chipmunk stayed with him forever. An old piece of paper torn from a book fell to the floor, and on its yellowed surface was written that magicians who were calmed by sacred beasts often experienced a strange, almost possessive feeling that connected them to these creatures. There have been cases where wizards who have become attached to their pets have felt jealous as if they themselves had become their owners, which has added elements of a struggle for attention to their relationship, as the lines written on this sheet of paper indicate. A new day had dawned, and the sky was filled with a deep blue color, as if illuminated by all the shades of dawn light, and the snow-white walls reflected this light, creating a feeling of purity and freshness in the air itself. The squirrel, not wanting to be left behind in the festive mood of the day, was elegantly decorated. Her fluffy fur was neatly combed, and a cute pink bow adorned her neck, which gave her incredible charm and made her even more attractive. Tizine, standing in the hallway with his pet, also looked dressed to the nines, as if ready for an important event. His clothes were exquisitely chosen, and on his face there was a light, confident smile that reflected his inner joy and confidence. Entering the room, the young man, apologizing for his tardiness, directed a slight smile towards the nobles present, expressing gratitude for their patience and understanding at this moment. His face was full of determination, despite his late arrival. In the same dining room, the Duchess and her daughter were already sitting. Along the table were the young man's mother and his cousin, who smiled politely, greeting him, creating an atmosphere of respect and refined nobility that reigned in this house. Suddenly, the chipmunk, feeling the bright light emanating from the stranger, hastily covered his face with his paws, trying to hide from the blinding radiance, as if it was something supernatural, like her beauty itself, which amazed everyone present. Princess Marielle was the epitome of beauty. Her large pink eyes radiated tenderness, her light hair fell in waves over her shoulders, and her dress, chosen with taste, was so refined that it seemed as if it were woven from tenderness itself, like a flower. Wanting to see the reaction of the aristocrat, who she believed had probably already fallen in love with her, the squirrel looked at him carefully, expecting to see the sparkle of love in his eyes. But instead, her expectations were dashed. However, Johann was indifferent, and moreover, all his attention was focused on the squirrel and not on the beautiful princess, which surprised her, because his interest was directed not at the aristocratic person, but at the small creature sitting next to her. And so, as soon as Mariel noticed the sacred rare creature in the hands of the young man, her face lit up and she cried out joyfully, folding her hands in front of her, as if this discovery could change the entire course of events, attracting all eyes. The Duchess was deeply impressed that the Duke's family owned such a rare and valuable animal and did not hide her admiration and respect for its condition, as it was not only a status symbol, but also an amazing miracle of nature that had so fortunately ended up in their hands. Tezin, sitting shyly next to his mother, smiled when they began to compare him to his father, and especially to his magical power, which everyone noted with admiration, and his modesty seemed even more charming against the background of these comparisons. The girl who was watching what was happening covered her mouth with her hand and quietly said that apparently the guy was really very strong, and there was a slight admiration in her voice that did not hide her curiosity about his abilities. Johann was silent at this time, sitting to the side, while everyone praised his cousin, the one who was so tenacious and proud, but the young man did not consider it necessary to join the conversation, preferring to remain in the shadows and observe the situation. Suddenly, Tizen roughly grabbed the squirrel by the paw, and the squirrel, squealing indignantly, began to struggle, not understanding such an act, because her little heart was disappointed by the cruelty with which she was treated, and she expressed her protest with her little cry. The young man was completely indifferent to the pet's feelings, and he continued to press his finger into her soft fur, lazily stroking the animal. Despite her protests, while it snored restlessly, there was not a shred of regret in this cruel treatment of the small creature. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, a strange vibration of magic hung around, ominous and tense, and the water in the glass began to tremble, creating the feeling that something supernatural was about to happen. It was Johann, whose power was furiously indignant that someone had touched his sacred pet so roughly, especially after he had been hurt so badly. His anger was growing, and as he sat at the table, he bowed his head, his gaze full of rage and intensity. Soon, as if in response to his growing anger, the dishes on the table cracked, and the glass, unable to withstand the hidden tension, shattered with a crash. The shards scattered across the floor, intensifying the feeling of tense menace that hung in the air. Silence fell around the table, and as if on cue, all the nobles turned their heads towards the aristocrat, watching his anger rage. Everyone's attention was riveted on him, and the tension in the room was palpable. Ella, in her confusion, noticed with alarm that Johann looked ill. His face was pale, and the glass of water in her hands seemed to have become heavy, as if magic itself had penetrated the very air, and her anxiety was transmitted even through such a simple object. At that moment, the chipmunk was deeply puzzled. He couldn't understand why the boy was so angry, because the day before he had helped him heal, getting rid of excess magic, and now the situation seemed completely incomprehensible to him. Full of concern and excitement, the squirrel hurried towards the young man, quickly walking towards him, to make sure that he was all right, that he had not been affected by the outburst of anger, and that he had not suffered from this sudden emotional outburst. However, he miscalculated his strength. The little animal jumped with such energy that he instantly found himself in the air, flying down, his little fur straightened out, expressing fear, ready for a hard collision with the floor. But at the very last moment, When it seemed that the fall was inevitable, someone's hand quickly appeared and deftly caught it, saving it from the impact and ensuring a soft landing for the small animal. Johann whispered softly to his little friend, with a soft note of concern in his voice, that it was not worth the risk, especially if he could not help him, expressing concern for his safety and worrying about the consequences of such an act. The young man was praised for his actions, for not remaining indifferent and saving someone else's pet, demonstrating his kindness and determination in a moment of danger. This did not go unnoticed by those present, but soon, Tazen, with genuine determination in his voice, demanded that his cousin immediately return the chipmunk, as if his words were not just a request, but a categorical order, from which there was not the slightest possibility of retreating, and no one would dare to disobey. Johann felt no desire to fulfill the request. His face remained as cold and impassive as always. However, realizing that at this moment he had no other choice, he finally gave in, silently giving in to the demand, without uttering a single word. But suddenly, as if to break the tense silence, Johann asked his cousin if he had already thought of a name for his pet. Tizen was momentarily embarrassed, realizing that he had forgotten to name his animal, and this made him feel a little awkward. The boy felt irritated, his gaze darkened, and he already opened his mouth about to call his squirrel a slave, but stopped in time, realizing that this was a completely indecent word that should not be uttered in the presence of guests. The boy, looking completely at a loss, as he tried to find a suitable name for his pet, considered options that involved the letter R. After much deliberation, he replied that he was still in the process of choosing and had not yet decided. Johann, who offered his cousin his help in a reserved and polite manner, only irritated Tizen even more, who became more and more angry and determined, with each passing moment, unable to control his mood. Suddenly, Marielle, who had been sitting silently nearby, intervened in the argument, and her calm intervention became an unexpected turn of events, attracting the attention of everyone present, creating a tense silence that covered the entire room. Joyfully folding her hands in front of her, the little girl, with a bright sparkle in her eyes, offered to come up with a name for such a cute chipmunk herself, her gaze full of tenderness and sincere admiration for this little creature. The squirrel, filled with the same enthusiasm as everyone around her, joyfully jumped towards the princess, as if her little heart felt the importance of this moment, striving to become a part of this sweet and touching moment. The lady, carefully examining the squirrel's appearance, could not help but notice her large, expressive eyes and fluffy tail, which harmoniously combined with her red fur, giving her even more charms. In the end, the noblewoman suggested the name Kamani, with a warm smile, but for the squirrel, this name was completely devoid of taste, and she turned around with obvious displeasure, as if not approving of such a banal choice. The nobles, however, were satisfied with this nickname and unanimously agreed in support of the noblewoman, considering that the name was entirely appropriate to the occasion and the position they attributed to the little animal. The little animal, somewhat confused, sat in front of the girl, feeling that he did not like the new name at all, but realizing that he had no choice until the princess tied a small rope with an elegant ribbon on his paw, giving him a special look. The shocked little animal stared in surprise at the ribbon that adorned its paw, and at that moment, as if by magic, it felt a sudden surge of magical power that filled its little being with an unknown excitement. In complete shock, the squirrel suddenly realized that the thread wrapped around his leg was made of pure gold. This discovery filled his little heart with a sense of importance, as if this moment were something greater and more significant than just a random detail. The little animal froze in front of his cousins, watching their reactions with caution. Tizen was calling his pet to him, while Johann sat silently nearby, not expressing any emotions, just watching what was happening. Squirrel closed her eyes, struggling with her emotions, realizing that the only right choice was to go to her hated owner and not to his sweet relative, who, although he seemed more pleasant, could not be so important to her at this critical moment. However, Johann looked so aristocratic, his gaze was full of hidden pain, and his downcast eyes and slightly furrowed brows reflected a sadness that could not be hidden behind the impenetrable outer shell. The young man watched with jealousy and envy as the chipmunk easily leaped onto his relative's shoulder. Bitterness rose within him as he realized that this cute little animal had chosen someone else, not him, and this feeling intensified his inner pain. Johann turned away his gaze, and thoughts quickly racing elsewhere. Kamani was supposed to be his animal, and the injustice of the little creature being attached to another, even if it was his own, tormented his soul, filling it with disappointment. The library was dark, with only a few candles dimly illuminating the space. Books stood on shelves, and a single torch burned in the corner, its weak flame casting a shadow and a glimmer of light across the old chaos that lay on the floor. The man standing in the shadows rubbed his boots in irritation and muttered quietly that, as expected, he should not have let go of the sacred animal, since the consequences of such haste could not but be sad and unsatisfactory. Just when the silence in the room had become almost unbearable, a guest entered the room, attracting the attention of the lady sitting at the table. He called her by name Ravenna, and her gaze immediately turned to him, trying to understand what he wanted to say. It was a man with a beard and deep wrinkles on his face, dressed in a strict white uniform, and in his hands he held a report he had just received from her, which seemed to shed light on something important that required immediate attention. Ravenna slowly turned towards her guest when he raised the question of whether or not to return the chipmunk that had recently been sold to the duchy, and her face became thoughtful, as if she was searching for the right answer. Without much hesitation, the woman immediately agreed with her partner that the animal from the temple should be returned, since it was an integral part of their experiment, and further actions depended on its participation in this important process. In the lady's slender fingers rested a test tube containing a mysterious liquid shimmering in the candlelight, and looking at it with cold detachment, she dispassionately confirmed that they needed the squirrel immediately, without delay or unnecessary talk. Extreme caution had to be exercised, as this sacred creature was in the hands of the Kairad family, meaning that any careless action could lead to unpredictable consequences that could turn against them. Moreover, it was impossible to forget that the tiny squirrel, despite its innocent appearance, could well remember everything that happened to it before, during, and even after the cruel experiment. The man merely waved his hand dismissively, indicating that there was no cause for concern, and with a slight grin assured his colleague that he had carefully double-checked everything beforehand, eliminating any possible errors in calculations and preparation. That same day, the Duchess, whose heart was full of hidden despair, made a generous donation, hoping that it would somehow help her second son, who, unlike his eldest, had almost no magical abilities, and therefore was doomed to a bleak future. The lady calmed down a little after hearing the confirmation that her first son was still imprisoned in the tower, meaning that the likelihood of the sacred animal being able to acquire human form and intelligence remained extremely low, almost impossible. However, the thought that the animal could suddenly turn into a human continued to worry the woman, as this would mean that their secret experiments could get out of control, and the consequences of such an event were unpredictable. Bending over the notes, the lady nevertheless expressed her fears that despite their caution, the small animal could somehow encounter the Duke's second son, who, according to rumors, possessed incredible magical powers, and this meeting could turn into a disaster. However, for their experiments, they needed that very chipmunk, and realizing how great the risk was if the animal ended up out of their control, the lady firmly ordered her partner to return it immediately without allowing the slightest mistake. Barely containing his fatigue, her partner clutched his head, sighed heavily, and realizing that he had no other choice, reluctantly agreed to carry out the assignment, fully understanding how difficult this task would be. Johann stood frozen at the window of his room, allowing himself to enjoy the calm atmosphere of the evening for a moment, when suddenly his attention was drawn to something strange, something that violated the usual order of things, and he felt a subtle anxiety growing in his chest. Behind the glass, barely visible in the dim light, a squirrel stood modestly and hesitantly, as if hesitating before taking the next step, as if it needed confirmation that it could indeed enter, or an inner confidence. The boy with a kind smile stepped closer to his little friend and gently said that he did not have to knock every time, because the doors were always open for him, and he could come whenever he wanted. The little animal was visibly embarrassed to hear such sincere and warm words, as he was unaccustomed to such treatment. Johann turned out to be such a kind and sensitive person that even simple concern on his part seemed incredible, almost miraculous. The young man was not only handsome, but also possessed amazing strength. His magic was truly powerful, and his thick, dark hair, reminiscent of raven feathers, gave his appearance a mysterious and attractive appearance. Noticing that the chipmunk was looking at him intently, Johann tilted his head slightly to the side and asked curiously why the little animal was looking at him so attentively, trying to understand what was going on in his thoughts. Feeling tired after all the events he had experienced, he carefully took the tiny creature in his palms as if it were the most precious gift, and quietly exhaling, allowed himself to sink onto the bed, feeling the tension leave his body, giving him peace. The little animal stretched out its paws towards him, as if trying to say that if the boy pressed it to his forehead, it could help him, transmitting warmth and strength that could heal fatigue and drive away disturbing thoughts, enveloping his mind in a calming peace. The aristocrat, however, was in no hurry to part with this moment. He held the tiny creature in his palms with particular care, not wanting to let go so quickly, as if his presence gave something more than just warmth, a feeling of elusive but happiness. Gently pressing the tiny animal to his face, Johann, with a warm, slightly tired smile, whispered a request to stay with him just a little longer, enjoying the rare moment of comfort, as if trying to prolong the feeling of calm and tender affection. The squirrel, gracefully waving her paw as if in approval, gently made it clear that she agreed to spend a little more time with the handsome man, giving him her quiet but sincere warmth, as if she herself felt how important it was for him. So the nobleman remained on the bed, watching the little chipmunk curiously rummaging through his hair with its little paws, as if gently stroking it, and joyfully feeling the peace that this simple but touching scene brought. On one of the paws still hung a thin golden thread that the princess had tied on it, a gift symbolizing their unknown connection, so touchingly woven into everyday moments of life, and in memory of their first encounter with this sacred animal. Then, during dinner, the princess delightedly extended her hands to the little animal, not hiding her admiration, seeing for the first time such a holy animal, which was now before her, and in which she felt something unusual and important for herself. The boy didn't like the fact that it was the noblewoman, not he, who had named the pet. At some point, succumbing to a sudden impulse, he carefully picked up the squirrel, and unable to contain his emotions, gently placed it on the table nearby, determined to exert his power over the moment. Stroking the animal's soft fur, he quietly said that the name Kamani did not suit the squirrel at all, as if hoping that his words could change something, and in this simple act he expressed all his affection and desire to give his pet a name that he considered more suitable. The girl he saw during her transformation clearly needed a name that would reflect her innocence and charm, and he decided that Momo would be perfect, as it embodied her tenderness and vulnerability at that moment. With a smile on his face, the boy settled down in front of the little animal, looking at it with genuine interest, not knowing how exactly the squirrel would react to this name, which in his opinion should suit and reflect its natural charm. But despite all her efforts, the squirrel was not impressed by this nickname. It seemed to her that all these attempts to give her names were nothing more than unsuccessful and stupid labels. Each one was worse than the last, and none of them suited her. Turning around with a slight look of disappointment, the little animal pretended to be satisfied with the name, although in reality this was far from the case, and his face betrayed obvious displeasure, despite his attempts to hide his true feelings. Johann continued to watch his pet with a smile, unable to hide his joy at how cute and carefree the animal looked, but there was also a hint of wariness in his gaze, as if he was looking for answers to questions hidden in its behavior. Suddenly, without breaking the silence, he carefully touched the chipmunk, curiously asking if their first meeting had been a coincidence, as if trying to understand what exactly connected them with this small creature that had now become a part of his life. The boy continued to gently stroke the animal's soft fur, and it quietly squeaked in response, enjoying this attention, although his gaze revealed deeper thoughts than just the simple pleasure of caressing. Momo was always so sweet and determined, holding a nut in her paws, that Johann, observing her determination, promised himself to always protect her, becoming her reliable friend and protector in this strange and wonderful world where they met. The man promised his pet that he would give him even more gold if he stayed with him, and this promise sounded like a real call to loyalty that should have kept him by his side no matter what happened. The chipmunk, in complete shock, listened with bated breath as the future duke spoke of the riches he was ready to offer, promising entire rooms filled with treasures and everything the little animal could only dream of, as he had never dreamed of before. After this, the young man said with complete confidence that he would always protect his pet, and these words contained not only the promised protection, but also unwavering affection, which left no doubt about the sincerity of his intentions. In the near future, according to the book's plot, The boy was to be sent to the battlefield where he would face danger and receive magical potions in his hands that could tame his power, which could become both his gift and his curse. There, in the midst of a bleak landscape, where the land was devastated by wars and swords left their marks on the hard ground, he was to take part in battles full of cruelty and senseless bloodshed, and his destiny was bound to that battlefield. And soon, Johann could forget about the magical creature, leaving it in his shadow to move on, striving for his goals, and only the memories of this little friend would remain in his past, where he did not have time to find a place for it. However, despite the inevitability of time, Momo was ready to stay by his side, to help and heal him like a faithful companion, despite all her fragility, sincerely hoping that her presence could comfort and support him in the most difficult moments. A new day had dawned, and the palace was once again filled with bustle, when suddenly a loud voice was heard, asking why a carriage from the temple had arrived, which caused a slight tension and interest among the servants, as if they were expecting something important and unusual. The maids, talking loudly among themselves, discussed that probably some influential and rich people had arrived to see them, perhaps with an important mission or purpose, and this left a feeling of anticipation and suspense in the air. There were rumors that the chief priest himself had come to the Duchess for a private conversation, and in a dark room they sat opposite each other as if preparing to discuss something important that would influence their future actions. The man holding a cup of tea in his hand calmly stated that he had arrived after learning that the lady's son had absolutely no ability or talent for magic, and this statement was like a blow that destroyed her previous hopes and plans. The lady, hearing these words, recoiled in shock, unable to believe what she had heard, since before the priest had seemed completely satisfied and had not expressed any doubts regarding her son and his future in their society. The man continued his speech, insisting that the holy animal be returned to him, and only then would he agree to take it to the temple, where its abilities would be properly assessed and its future fate would be decided. A tear streamed down the lady's face, and she swallowed, feeling the tension build, and her words hang in the air, unsure how to respond to demands that would jeopardize her own plans and her son's future. The priest continued his speech, claiming that no one but him knew the dirty secrets of their family, and his words sounded like a sentence, revealing hidden dark sides that could destroy everything that Lady Ella had built for so long. Ella frowned, feeling her inner peace begin to crumble, and suggested ending the topic as she was not at all happy with the demand to return the animal back, as it had become something more than just a pet to her. The man, waving his hand aside, ignoring her displeasure, stated that he had brought medication for her son as an alternative and that he would take the animal with him, which left the lady with little choice if she wanted to help her child. Intrigued, the woman looked away, considering the situation. It was a good offer, and she knew it offered her a way to resolve the problem with her son, albeit at the cost of losing the pet she had become so dear to her. Covering her face with her hand, the young noblewoman smiled, despite her inner struggle, and having made a decision, agreed to the offer, realizing that in this situation, the medicine was the most important thing, even if the price was high. But before giving the animal to the priest, she decided to ask for something, because she wanted to know something important before taking the final step that could affect her entire future and the future of her family. One thought was increasingly occupying her mind. Why had her eldest dear son become such a rebel, behaving too defiantly and inappropriately, as if he was trying to hide his true nature and get out of her control? With a sly laugh, Ella stated that she had heard of a potion that supposedly existed in the temple and that could turn a person into an obedient puppet-like creature, and she would very much like to get it for herself in order to use it for her own purposes and strengthen her power over those around her. It was a gray day outside, and the fog hid the sun, creating a gloomy atmosphere, while inside the palace, it was cold, as if winter had come too early, and the whole atmosphere was filled with a sense of threatening timelessness. The squirrel sitting in a tree suddenly felt an unusual fear that gripped her small body, as if an unknown threat was creeping up on her, and her instincts told her that something terrible and irreversible could happen today. Her face was tense and frightened, because she realized that she was in mortal danger, feeling how everything around her was filling with tension and a threat from which she would not be able to escape so easily. All this time, the chipmunk eavesdropped on the conversation between the priest and the Duchess, learning about their cunning and sinister plans that could change his life and the lives of other creatures whom they used as pawns in their cruel game. In the original novel, the squirrel also disappeared at this moment when she was taken from her home and taken to the temple for cruel experiments, leaving behind only bitter memories and an unclear fate that no one could predict. Then she was sent to a cage from which she could no longer escape, and everything that was known about her subsequent fate remained in the darkness, like one of many sinister experiments that disappeared into the labyrinths of experiments that remained beyond human understanding. Momo definitely didn't want to be subjected to cruel experiments and returned to the temple laboratory where she once lived, remembering all the horrors and pain she had to endure and dreading what might await her. Then the animal ran headlong along the branch, fearing that the Duchess might take drastic measures against her eldest son and turn him into a weak-willed doll, obedient to her orders and desires, deprived of any freedom. This is the medicine that Johann in the original novel gave to his bride, to make her the ideal wife he used, in an attempt to make her fall in love with him, turning her into a puppet of his feelings and desires, controlled by his will. The tall tower, where everything seemed distant and silent, began to absorb the evening darkness, when the moment of silence arrived, and only shadows and vague forms reminded that time does not stand still, and everything around is inevitably changing. At this time, Johann, sitting in his room at his desk, read books and papers, absorbed in study, trying to understand the complex issues that troubled him and solve problems that required attention and diligence. Suddenly, the young man's attention was drawn to the piercing sound of an animal's squeak, and he turned sharply to see his faithful companion, Momo, sitting on the windowsill, clearly anxious and with difficulty breathing, which made him wary. On the windowsill in front of him sat his sweet little squirrel Momo, who seemed more and more agitated and tense with every breath she took, as if something alarming was happening, and she was trying to convey an important warning to her friend. The young man, concerned about the condition of his pet, hurried to approach his little friend, and the squirrel, noticing his approach, began to squeak loudly, desperately, trying to convey to him the alarming news of the sinister plans that were being made behind his back. The little animal, sensing danger, screamed in its own language, its small body trembling with fear, desperately trying to convey the information that the evil stepmother, seeking to control it, was trying to poison it and turn it into her obedient puppet. However, Johann finally realized that the squirrel was trying to warn him of a terrible danger, that the warning was not just an alarm cry, but also a reflection of the fact that someone close to him intended to kill him, and this realization shocked him to the core. The chipmunk wondered how to convey to his friend the terrible truth that he was being betrayed, that the danger was much closer than he could have imagined, and how to explain all this without causing even more fear and misunderstanding. The animal, realizing that it had no other choice, decided to hide under the sheet, trying to escape the gaze of the aristocrat, who seemed not to understand what was happening, and continued to look at the animal with confusion on his face. Suddenly, a bright light cut through the darkness, and Momo appeared in the room, but in human form, a pretty girl with curls, who, as it turned out, was not just a pet, but someone much more important and powerful. The young man, stunned by her sudden appearance, stood there unable to understand what was happening when the girl pushed him, shouting that they did not have time for explanations and that he should focus on more important things because the danger was creeping closer and closer. The young man's eyes widened in shock and horror as he realized that the girl, his faithful companion, was planned to be taken back to the temple to be used for terrible experiments, and this revelation seemed to shake him to the very depths. The little girl explained that she had overheard a conversation between his stepmother and the priest, where they discussed how, since the squirrel did not have the necessary talent for magical calming, it should be returned to the lab for further experiments. Sweat poured down the boy's face as the thought that Momo was going to leave right now and leave him overwhelmed him with a suffocating sense of unease, and he couldn't believe that such a moment could come so quickly. As soon as the thought entered his mind, the little girl rushed towards him, her steps quick and confident, her voice loud and decisive, as she said that she had an important request that she needed to convey. Putting her hand to her chest, she asked him with humility and hope on her face to erase the mark on her body, explaining that in this way, she would be freed from the shackles and would be able to gain freedom, and only he could help the little girl with this. The boy froze, feeling a deep shock when Momo explained to him that as the heir of her line, he had the power and ability to erase the mark that held her captive, and only then could she gain the freedom she longed for. With desperation and determination, the boy knelt down in front of the girl who was sitting on the bed, and at that moment his heart was filled with a mixture of excitement and pain, realizing that the woman's future depended on his actions. He swore that he would definitely destroy that mark on her body, because he could not allow her to die because of that damn trace, and in his eyes there burned a sincere determination and concern for her fate, a willingness to sacrifice everything for her safety. Reaching out, he gently touched the mark on Momo's body, his fingers soft yet determined, as he began to erase the mysterious mark that held her captive, a crucial step in freeing her. As soon as the sign disappeared, Momo sighed with relief and thanked her friend, feeling the weight lift from her soul and freedom become a reality. Now she could leave this house where she was being held and set out on her new journey. But despite her relief, Johann was still in danger, and this news made him immerse himself in thoughts. Why all this was happening, what was hidden behind this threat, and what terrible consequences could await him in the future. The bitter truth was revealed that the evil stepmother had indeed planned to poison him to force him to submit to her will, and this discovery greatly shocked the young man because he could not even imagine that his loved ones were so inclined. Therefore, the girl, showing concern, ordered the boy to eat only cold food because it was the one that did not contain poison, and if he was suddenly brought something hot, he should insist that it be cooled before he ate it. When Johann tried to object and interrupt her, she firmly told him to be silent and continued her speech, expressing concern that he might soon be sent to the battlefield, where his life would again be in terrible danger. Johann, overwhelmed with strong emotions, suddenly grabbed her hands and, looking into her eyes, tenderly said that he was not worried about himself, but only about her, because her safety was more important to him than anything else in this huge world. The boy almost burst into tears when he realized that the little girl had spent all her magic on the transformation just to warn him and tell him the truth, to warn him of a possible threat risking her great power. Touched and shocked, Johann lowered his head, and Momo, with love and tenderness in her eyes, looked at him. She was ready to do anything to make life easier for her older friend, even if it meant putting herself in danger. The little girl carefully placed her hand on his head, gently stroking him, trying to calm him down and convey her care, making it clear that he was not alone in this world and could always count on a woman's necessary support. After this, Momo smiled. Her expression became much softer, and she quietly asked her friend not to worry, assuring him that she would always be there, ready to support and help him, despite any difficulties that might come his way. The young man tenderly embraced the girl, vowing that for her sake he was ready to survive even among the dark intrigues of his evil family, and that he would do everything to ensure her safety, despite all the trials that lay ahead. Johann jerked his head up and cried out in fear, remembering that he had long wanted to ask her where she planned to go after escaping, but unfortunately, he did not have time to voice this important question, since everything happened too quickly. Momo suddenly transformed back into a squirrel, lost consciousness, as she had used all her strength trying to protect and help her friend, and now her small, exhausted body could not cope with such stress. Johann recoiled in fear, feeling a sense of unease rise in his chest as he heard footsteps approaching them. Thoughts flashed through his mind that someone would soon be nearby, creating a sense of growing danger. He quickly took the squirrel into his arms, his voice filled with concern, as he ordered her to hide immediately, for she was in real danger now, and he could not allow her to get into trouble. His heart sank heavily with foreboding. He sternly told the chipmunk to hide deep in the forest, away from prying eyes, so that she would be safe. Johann understood that this moment was crucial, and all he could do now was protect her in any way possible. After this, he then carefully tied his own ribbon around the chipmunk's neck, asking him to always wear the ornament with him, to symbolize their special bond, and to keep his memory close to his little friend. This way, he could be sure that he would always know where his faithful pet was, and in case of a threat, he would be able to protect him, because now their bond was firmly cemented by the symbol of his care, devotion, and constant attention. Sitting down by the window, the boy quietly told the squirrel to go away, assuring her that he himself would distract the guests so that they would not notice the disappearance of her little companion, since it was important for him to maintain the secret and safety of his close friend. Upset, the boy could hardly hold back his tears as he said goodbye to his only friend, feeling how sadness filled his heart because their paths had to diverge, and it was hard for him since there was no one else around except this little one. Finally, the squirrel jumped out of the window, escaping, and the young man was left alone, once again immersed in loneliness, which pressed unbearably on his chest because now he had neither a pet nor a faithful friend nearby. Before leaving, the squirrel turned around and took one last look at its owner, who stood alone, absorbed in the world, feeling his loneliness become even more acute and palpable without the presence of his faithful companion nearby. In farewell, the chipmunk raised his paw and waved it to the young man, as if saying goodbye forever, after which he disappeared into the darkness of the night, leaving him alone with thoughts of those rare but immeasurably precious moments that they experienced together. The mansion of the Duke's sinister family remained in complete silence. The window seemed empty and lifeless, and the cloudy day only added to the feeling of abandonment and anxiety, as if the house itself was consumed by darkness. All this time, Jonah sat by the window, lost in thought, mentally saying goodbye to his friend. His soul was filled with sadness and melancholy, as if everything bright and good in his life had left along with this little creature, leaving only emptiness. The carriage that had been brought from the temple was still parked outside, and the people who had been looking for the chipmunk all over the estate continued their unsuccessful search, but the animal was never found, having disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared. The young boy, still unable to take his eyes off the window, turned to the door, when suddenly a man entered the room, loudly announcing his visit, breaking the silence and absorbing the young man's thoughts with his unexpectedness. It was a male servant who informed his master that he had dropped by briefly to check on his quarters, as if inadvertently interrupting the moment of solitude and creating the feeling that someone was breaking into his private world. When the owner asked what had happened, the man explained that they had all been looking for a cousin's pet, which had disappeared, and no one could find it, which only increased the anxiety and suspicion, as if the loss was something deeper than just a missing pet. Jonah, hiding his feelings, calmly lied that he hadn't seen the squirrel. His voice was calm, but inside a storm raged because he didn't want to give away his friend's location, realizing how important this secret was for both of them. However, the servant, without feeling any embarrassment, unceremoniously entered the room and began to carefully examine it, obviously in search of the animal for which a reward was promised, and it was clear that his intentions were not so harmless. With a smile on his face, the young man suddenly offered the servant a deal. If he brought him a chipmunk, he could put the mark of their kind on it, and no one would be able to distinguish this animal from the real escaped pet, making his plan work. The man would then receive a reward for it by bringing the body to the owners and claiming that the animal died because it was bitten by a dog, creating a plausible story that would allow him to avoid all suspicion and receive a well-deserved reward. The servant would have been grateful to the master for such an act, but he was tormented by doubts. What benefit could the master derive from this deal, and what kind of interest was hidden behind such a strange offer, which seemed somewhat suspicious? The young man, noticing the servant's confusion, simply asked him to bring cold food, bread, or something similar, nothing more, showing that there was nothing complicated or overly demanding in his request, but simply his usual desire. Turning to his servant, he calmly explained that he had simply been very hungry lately, and these simple treats would help him satisfy his hunger without causing anyone any unnecessary trouble, especially in such a tense situation. Ultimately, the man agreed to the deal, agreeing to go in search of the dead chipmunk in order to mark it and pass it off as the missing pet, fully aware of the importance of carrying out this plan and earning a reward. Jonah was left alone in his room, standing in complete silence, his thoughts overwhelmed by conflicting feelings, and the world outside the windows seemed so far away, as if he was locked in this loneliness that now surrounded him. In his thoughts, the squirrel was always next to him, comfortably nestled on the bed, its presence bringing peace and support, as if there were no worries or anxieties, just the two of them, and everything around was safe. But now the bed was empty, and its place remained only a lifeless spot, reminding the young man that his only friend had gone away, and he was left alone, leaving this place that was once filled with joy, comfort, and great warmth. In fact, the young man wanted to keep the girl with him, but he couldn't, realizing that by leaving her nearby, he would put her in danger, and even the closest friendship was not worth risking her life for the sake of his own comfort. The baby was so sweet and kind, and for her sake, the future Duke was ready to do anything was ready to sacrifice everything so that her life would be safe and happy, even if he had to go through the most difficult trials. Sitting down on the bed, Johann sighed quietly, trying to calm himself down, saying that now the squirrel would be safe, hiding his face in the sheets, barely holding back tears, because now he was completely alone, without the friend who was once there. He gripped the soft fabric of the sheet tightly with his fingers, as if trying to hold on to the last shreds of self-control, and tried with all his might to hold back the tears that treacherously burned his eyes, threatening to burst out along with the pain tormenting his heart. Night fell when the full moon illuminated the dark sky, and the stars twinkled brightly, as if showing the way to those who dared to enter this world full of mysteries and premonitions, where every step could lead to unpredictable consequences. The princess sat at her desk, absorbed in yet another letter from an imperial citizen, asking for significant financial assistance, stating that they needed a large sum to support the front. She understood perfectly well that the situation at the front was now difficult and financial support was vital, but each such request presented her with a difficult choice: how to help and preserve resources for other needs of the empire. Then, at the most inopportune moment, a strange noise sounded behind her. The princess turned around in fear, her heart began to beat faster, and her eyes darted around the room, trying to figure out the source of the sound that had broken the silence of the night. The sound coming from the street was barely audible, but its source was on the second floor, which made the beautiful Marielle wonder who could be there near her window, and what brought him here, disturbing the silence of the night and her peace. Approaching the window, Marielle decided to find out what was the cause of the strange sound that had disturbed her peace, and lifting the curtain in the silence of the night, she asked who was outside and what had brought him here at such a late hour. On the windowsill sat her familiar Chipmunk, drained with fatigue, his tiny paws barely holding him in place, and he seemed completely devoid of strength, as if the last of his energy had left him, leaving only a weak breath. When Marielle's gaze fell on the little animal's paw, she noticed a thin golden thread and immediately realized that this animal belonged to her friend. At that moment, the chipmunk suddenly began to lose its balance and began to fall helplessly. The animal blinked, trying to come to his senses, but there was impenetrable darkness all around, absorbing his thoughts and feelings, like a last breath disappearing into the darkness of the night, leaving only a weak flicker in his eyes, barely struggling with such darkness. Squirrel came to in unfamiliar, brightly lit chambers, nestled comfortably on a soft pillow, her eyes still blinking, trying to figure out where she was and what had happened, while her memories of what had happened remained vague. Marielle, overcome with anxiety for the animal's condition, hurriedly walked towards it with a tray containing nuts, her face reflecting genuine care and concern for the poor animal, which was in such an exhausted and weakened state. The lady sat down on the sofa next to the pile of the carpet, quietly watching the squirrel regain its strength, enjoying the nuts, and with each bite its small body was filled with new energy, as if awakening from a long sleep. The little animal devoured the nuts with genuine joy, as if each of them were a small miracle, filling his taste buds with amazing delight, and he could not get enough of this unprecedented pleasure. Obviously, the princess never stopped wondering how the squirrel had managed to overcome such a long and difficult journey to get to her house, and what was the mysterious circumstance that brought it here at this strange and unexpected moment. When Marielle suggested taking the squirrel home, the animal waved its paws indignantly, as if trying to show that it did not want to return to its former place, where only trouble awaited it. The little animal jumped sharply off the bed and quickly ran to the stack of papers, trying to show the lady that returning home would be too dangerous, since a serious threat awaited him there, which he wanted to warn her about. The cute squirrel quickly found one of the documents, and intently pointing at it with its paw, did not take its eyes off the princess, as if trying to convey to her the importance of this evidence, which could confirm the truth of his words. Slowly and carefully, the animal began to point to individual syllables in different parts of the paper, as if to claim that it had escaped for a special purpose and could not return, for behind this act lay a serious threat that threatened its life. The princess screamed in horror, imagining that the poor squirrel had been abused and suffered in its home, and her heart filled with deep sympathy for this innocent creature who seemed undeserving of such a fate. The noblewoman began to gently stroke the animal's fur, trying to calm him down, and softly whispering words of comfort, assured him that no one would dare to hurt him or cause him harm again, that he was now safe and under her protection. Sweet Marielle, remembering how cruelly the owner treated the pet, promised the squirrel that from now on, she would protect it with all her might and would not allow anyone to dare to do such a thing to this sweet and defenseless creature again. The calm priest stood next to his companion and, shaking his head sadly, told how the sacred animal had failed to return to life. It had departed this world despite all desperate attempts, and now their efforts had been in vain. The woman, with obvious disbelief, said that the animal had died on the very day they arrived with it, which looked very suspicious, and she began to doubt the whole situation, as if something did not add up. The man, while reluctantly agreeing, insisted that the chipmunk was dead when he arrived, and that there was a duke's family mark on its body, clearly indicating its family affiliation and casting doubt on what had happened. Ravenna expressed her doubts, pointing out that not everything in this story was as simple as it seemed at first glance, and that it was worth paying attention to several details that could hint at deeper problems and questions. Placing his hand on the shoulder of his stern companion, the priest said that she had worked too much and should stop thinking so restlessly about the squirrel, because sometimes rest was necessary for clarity of thought. Moreover, he added that there was no need to worry so much, since usually sacred animals sitting in cages did not have a particular desire to become human and gain intelligence, so perhaps the worries were in vain. Time passed, and the squirrel gradually accumulated so much magical power that it became noticeably stronger, more agile, and more confident in its abilities. Realizing that paths were now opening up before it, that it could previously only dream of. Now, the animal spent time not only at meals with the princess in the dining room, but also in a variety of places where their conversations became increasingly warm, filled with laughter, trust, and a feeling as if their destinies were connected by an invisible thread. Previously, the squirrel was convinced that the princess possessed the same powerful magic as her legendary lover from the book, but as they communicated each day, it became increasingly clear that reality was far from corresponding to these fairy tale ideas. Looking around in confusion, the cute chipmunk tried to figure out why a lady with such impressive power did not have a sacred animal, because it would seem such a creature should have accompanied her by right. Suddenly, the pet heard someone say his name, and succumbing to the unexpected call, he immediately turned sharply, warily, looking around in search of the one whose voice cut through the silence, making his heart beat a little faster. Mariel stood before him, her tired appearance speaking for itself, dark circles under her eyes, a strained smile, strands of hair falling out of her once neat hairstyle, giving her an even more exhausted look. Sinking heavily to the floor, as if the last of her strength had left her, the beauty exhaled wearily, and then barely audibly muttered that today had been an especially difficult day for her, leaving in her soul only fatigue and a desire to forget herself for a moment in silence. With a distraught sigh, the lady admitted that she had recently received a huge number of letters from people desperately asking her for financial assistance, and in addition to this, a war was brewing in the empire that threatened to turn into a catastrophe. The squirrel was not only outraged, but also deeply saddened to learn that the lady, despite the lack of tax revenue from the people, continued to support them, as if not noticing how this was draining her own resources. In the original version of the book, Mariel was described as kind and dazzlingly beautiful, but far removed from political intrigue, and therefore too easily succumbed to the persuasion of others, and was influenced by those around her. But suddenly, the squirrel, noticing something strange, started warily, then sharply pointed its paw towards the fireplace, forcing the beauty, frowning, to turn her gaze in bewilderment to the flickering flames in the hearth, in which the dancing tongues of fire were reflected. Without thinking twice, the chipmunk began to act out a whole scene. He pretended to chop wood energetically, swinging an imaginary axe, desperately, trying to make his interlocutor understand what he was hinting at. And then, leaning back, he demonstratively sighed, as if exhausted from fatigue, and crossing his paws in front of himself, made a stern sign, enough, as if hinting that further continuation in this spirit was impossible and unacceptable. Finally, Mariel smiled warmly, realizing what a brilliant idea the animal was trying to convey to her. Nobles who asked for financial assistance could very well give part of their funds not in gold, but in firewood, since in the hot region they had no need for wood at all. The animal smiled happily, nodding cheerfully, as if a ray of sunshine had passed across its face, confirming that the beauty had finally figured out its plan. It straightened proudly, beaming with joy, for its message had been heard and understood. Inspired by such resourcefulness, the lady carefully hugged her pet, holding him tenderly close, and with tenderness in her voice, praised him, calling him not only smart, but also a real fellow capable of solving even the most difficult problems. After this, she asked her little friend with slight embarrassment whether he would mind if she continued to confide her experiences to him and ask for advice, since his views and ability to find a way out of difficult situations turned out to be invaluable. In the end, the aristocrat smiled gratefully and quietly thanked God that she was lucky enough to meet such a smart and good squirrel who was always there, ready to support and share his light. The evening at the mansion, as the sun slowly set, filled everything around with a warm, soft golden light, creating an incredibly beautiful and peaceful atmosphere, as if time itself had slowed down and stopped at this magical moment. At this time, the lovely noblewoman was sitting on the bed. Her face was covered in tears, and in her hands she was tugging at strands of her brown hair, her eyes dimly reflecting the pain of loss and loneliness that the girl could not hide. Running her fingers through the severed strands, she couldn't help but think of a long-lost person, a girl named Eureka, who had been something special to her, and whose disappearance had left an indelible mark on her heart. The Duchess couldn't hold back her tears. Her heart was torn apart by the longing for her second daughter, who had disappeared many years ago when they went to the temple together. Tears rolled down her cheeks, reflecting all her unspoken pain and loss. Her daughter was still very small, then tenderly wrapped in a warm blanket, and suddenly she disappeared, as if she had dissolved into thin air, leaving behind only an insurmountable void, without the slightest trace that could provide any explanation. The mansion with green roofs, where high-pointed tops rose like beautiful precious stones, and the bright, eternally shining interior of the corridors created an atmosphere of mystery and incomprehensible beauty. At this time, the chipmunk perched on a tree was enjoying a moment of rest, nestling his small furry body among the branches, feeling how the world around him slowed down and he could relax. It was a picturesque garden, where maids busy with their daily chores strolled calmly along the green paths, chatting about something bright and insignificant, filling the space with a light rustle and a pleasant ringing, creating an atmosphere of peace. Suddenly, their attention was drawn to the squirrels, who were listening with alarm to the sounds coming from the window of a building located very close by, whose voice, as if piercing the silence, carried through the garden and filled it with a strange excitement and vague anxiety. Inside the building, in a secluded room, sat the Duchess, her face stained with tears, and in her hands she held a piece of paper that seemed unable to console her grief while her thoughts were completely consumed by anxiety and pain. Without delay, the chipmunk ran to the window and, pressing his muzzle to the glass, began to stare intently inside, trying to understand what was happening to the aristocrat whose mental pain was hidden behind these majestic walls. Quite quickly, the little animal remembered that there had been talk recently about the lady's health deteriorating, and although the rumors were vague, the anxiety in them was becoming more and more palpable and noticeable, forcing him to think about the possible consequences. The lady stopped crying when she heard a strange noise coming from the window on the side where the shady alleys began, and suddenly alert, she turned her attention to what was happening outside. Suddenly, a chipmunk appeared in front of her, a charming creature with large, curious eyes that scanned everything around them, looking up intently as if searching for something hidden from her sight. The noblewoman, in complete shock, looked at this animal in bewilderment, not understanding where it could have come from, appearing so unexpectedly in her room, as if it had escaped from some fairy tale path, leaving no trace or explanation. In an instant, as if by magic, the woman suddenly realized that in front of her was her daughter's pet, the one she had talked about so often, mentioning him with tenderness and warmth, as if he were a part of her very heart. As soon as the little animal settled on the torn strands of hair, it suddenly squeaked, looking questioningly at the woman, as if trying to understand where this hair came from, attracting her attention with its curious eyes. The aristocrat, with emotion and agitation in her voice, admitted that it was the hair of her long-lost daughter, and at that moment she realized that all that was left of her were just a few strands of memory that remained alive, despite the passage of time. The animal, listening attentively, seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, and as if sharing her grief, looked at the strands with deep sympathy, as if confirming that the girl had light brown hair and pink eyes like her sister. The woman tried to avoid talking about her second daughter, because every such conversation brought with it a wave of longing and sadness, leaving her heart heavy and inconsolable, as if the pain itself would not leave her. At the dinner table, the girl supported her mother. When the conversation turned to her sister, who had disappeared many years ago, she felt her mother's words colliding with her own pain and sadness, but she continued to be there as best she could. Ella, sitting calmly, without much emotion, said that sometimes the second child was simply annoying, and such things happened that children often disappeared, as if it was something ordinary and not worthy of attention. Moreover, she added with some relief that at least Marielle had grown into a good and obedient girl, delighting her with her calmness and behavior, as if trying to replace the lost daughter, as if this could console her at least a little. At the moment when the Chipmunk and Jonah came for lunch, they were silent, sitting quietly, listening attentively to every moment of the story, without interrupting it, and perceiving everything that was happening with absolute attention and concentration. On the day of the unexpected robbery attack, the carriage that was on its route stopped, and the woman, overcome with fear and panic, lost her child, which led her to a state of despair. The squirrel, listening attentively to the lady's speech, noticed how she suddenly fell silent and thought, asking herself why she decided to tell her experiences to an animal that could not answer or understand her worries. Suddenly, the pet, without saying a word, lay down on the bed, putting his tummy up, as if trying to calm and support the woman at that moment, expressing his support in a silent and warm manner. The little animal gently pointed to its belly with its paw, as if invitingly demonstrating that it was ready to receive affection, and thus demonstrating that the atmosphere could be changed and improved with a simple gesture of care and attention. The noblewoman laughed quietly, realizing that the animal, without requiring words, was hinting that his mood would certainly improve if she began to gently scratch his soft tummy, and a slight spark of joy played in her eyes. The lady's fingers, as if in response to this silent call, gently touched the pet's fluffy fur, and she began to stroke him, feeling how his body gradually relaxed from her gentle touches, leaving an atmosphere of comfort in the air. After this, she invited her pet to visit her from time to time, because she always had plenty of tasty nuts that could please the animal, giving him joy and satisfaction from the treat. Squirrel, hearing such a friendly invitation, smiled joyfully, her eyes filled with sincere agreement, and she without hesitation made it clear that she would be happy to spend time in the lady's company, enjoying her hospitality. So they sat there together, the Duchess settled on the bed, gently stroking her little pet, enjoying the warm and calm moment that filled the room with coziness, creating an atmosphere in which there was no room for worries or anxieties. Evening came, and the beauty of the sunset revealed itself outside the window. The city's tall towers framed the horizon, and long corridors filled with quiet light created an atmosphere of mystery and grandeur, emphasizing the grandeur of this place. Johann stood by the window, his gaze focused on the horizon. He was already wearing all the necessary equipment. He was standing in his room, but his thoughts still took him to the battlefield, where the battle was about to break out. Suddenly, a servant entered his room. Quickly turning around, he announced that it was time to prepare for departure, reminding him that everything would soon change, and the battle that was about to begin would become inevitable, and no one could stop it. The sleepy youth quietly followed the servant downstairs, carefully closing the door behind him. Not the slightest doubt remained in his soul. He was ready to go to war, feeling that this was his inescapable duty and the only path that led forward. Just recently, Johann was informed that his father had passed away, but he himself did not experience any pain or loss because he barely remembered his older parent, and all memories of him seemed vague and long forgotten to him. However, Johann's memory was firmly fixed on the words of his friend, who told him that he could have been poisoned with a special potion, turning him into an obedient puppet. And this disturbing thought did not leave his mind, forcing him to think. All the beauty's words turned out to be true. He was indeed given warm food in which poison was hidden, and he, unsuspecting, accepted it as a gift until he learned that it was precisely this that served to destroy him. If it weren't for Momo, Johann would have long ago become an obedient, submissive doll in the hands of his evil stepmother, who was obsessed with the thirst for power and control, not noticing how she was slowly taking away his freedom soul and the ability to be himself. The young man had long ago decided that upon returning from the war, he would destroy his family, which had harbored nothing but hatred for him all this time. His cousin and stepmother eagerly awaited his departure, not hiding their relief as if ridding themselves of a heavy burden. Johann pressed his hand to his chest. His gaze was determined, and without expressing any emotion, he said that he was leaving as the time had come for him to move forward, leaving behind everything that once connected him to this place. At this time, the princess sitting at the table in her cozy office anxiously read the news that the future duke had been sent to war, knowing that he was in poor health and feeling her heart fill with anxiety for his fate. Momo, with a nut in her paws, settled down on the table next to the princess, and realizing that her friend had indeed been sent to war as predicted in the novel, felt a heavy premonition that overwhelmed her despite her outward calm. Suddenly, the princess began to carefully and tenderly stroke the squirrel's head, thinking how once, when her mother began visiting her, her health suddenly improved, and she hoped that this care would have some magical effect. Releasing the nut, the squirrel slipped from the princess's hands and, running down the corridor, headed in its own direction. The surprised noblewoman asked where her pet was rushing to, not expecting such an abrupt departure, and not understanding the reason for his sudden escape. The beauty stood there in complete shock, watching as the animal suddenly began to transform into a human form. Her eyes widened in amazement, unable to believe what was happening right before her, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Hiding behind the green curtain, the girl embarrassedly muttered that she would explain everything to Marielle, but her voice was so quiet that it was difficult to make out what she was trying to say, barely finding words through her embarrassment. At that moment, the Duchess entered the room to hurry to her daughter with a disapproving look, but before she could say a word, she froze, struck by the unexpected scene that unfolded before her eyes. The noblewoman stood in complete shock, her hands clasped helplessly to her chest, her eyes wide with shock. She could not believe what she was seeing and could not comprehend what was happening, standing as if mesmerized by this incredible spectacle. In front of her stood her Eureka, her long-lost daughter, with pink large eyes, covered only by a curtain, but completely naked, which stunned her even more and made her heart beat in a rhythm of panic. Not believing her eyes, the aristocrat extended her hand towards her second daughter, her fingers trembling with excitement, and when Marielle called out to her, she tried to gain at least a little confidence in what was happening, but everything around seemed incredible. The little girl tried to calm her mother down, repeating that she was mistaken and that the girl standing in front of her was not her daughter and had nothing in common with Sister Marielle, claiming that everything that had happened was just a vague figment of her imagination. At that moment, the woman could not bear it any longer and lost consciousness. Too many feelings and emotions overwhelmed her, and her head was spinning from screams and confusion, as if her mind was absorbed by this incomprehensible reality. At this moment, Momo stood there in complete shock, not knowing what to do. She had been planning to tell the princess the truth, but she had never expected the Duchess to enter the room at that very moment, which put her in an extremely awkward position. The two young ladies sat in the room together, in a painful silence, until the little girl was given a new dress, and her appearance was no longer so revealing. She was now dressed, but there was still a feeling of uncertainty and anxiety in the air. Suddenly, Professor Brown, the Duchess's family's respected physician, entered the room and confidently announced that the lady was fine and was now resting safe and recovering from the shock she had experienced. Mariel approached the doctor with obvious anxiety. Her gaze betrayed concern, and he, noticing this, gently reassured her, saying that her mother would soon wake up as soon as the emotions subsided a little, and she would be able to gradually come to her senses. The doctor then cast a quick glance at the second lady, and after explaining the situation, said that the aristocrat had lost consciousness from a sudden shock which was caused by the astonishing events that were happening right before her eyes. The lady had always dreamed of finding her long-lost daughter, and probably mistook the little noblewoman for her own girl, because she looked so similar that this resemblance could not help but confuse her. The woman, immersed in a deep sleep, lay calmly in her comfortable bed, strictly observing the prescriptions of rest, which was so necessary for her complete recovery and return to normal life. The girls, overcome with indescribable horror, listened with bated breath as the Duchess grieved over the loss of her child, feeling incredible stress that literally squeezed the last of her strength out of her and left her without support. The doctor, with gentle seriousness, explained that during such a period, both psychological and physical stability, as well as calm, are especially important for a lady so that she can recover. After he had made his recommendations, the man bowed with dignity, gave way to rest, and departed, leaving the space necessary for restoration and inner balance. The little ladies remained in a room engulfed in complete silence, where every word, every movement seemed to echo in their souls, filling the space with an invisible anxiety that fettered their hearts, preventing them from finding comfort. Marielle, finally coming to her senses, turned to her interlocutor, asking with concern in her voice how much she was frightened by everything that had happened and how this could have affected her perception of events. The noblewoman, slightly embarrassed, apologized to the girl opposite, explaining that her mother had made a mistake in taking her for the missing daughter, since she also had pink eyes and the same curly hair as this girl. Momo raised her hands up, turning to the lady of this house with a sincere smile, assuring her that everything was completely fine with her, and that there was no need to apologize for what happened, because it would be much more correct for her to apologize for frightening everyone. Momo also added, with a hint of embarrassment, that she should be the one apologizing for the unusual and possibly frightening transformation she had caused everyone, causing unnecessary worry. Marielle, feeling relieved, smiled softly, and her face filled with joy, because she was happy to see her pet again in the form of a girl, which seemed so sweet and familiar to her. The princess, with a smile on her lips, explained that she had read in books about sacred creatures, and now seeing such an unusual girl before her, she felt even more confident in her understanding of these magical creatures. When asked where she got her magical powers, Momo hesitated, taking a long time to answer, and finally began to slowly explain that this was a rather complex question, and she herself did not fully understand the nature of her abilities. This was a real shock for the princess. She learned that all this time, the squirrel had been feeding on her magic, which supported its magical power, and she herself had no idea that it could be the source of such energy. The noblewoman, with slight bewilderment, stated that although she possessed unusual abilities, she had never used magic in the full sense of the word, and it was difficult for her to explain how she had acquired such powers without understanding their source. Momo lowered her head and, barely audibly muttering, admitted that, nevertheless, her interlocutor did indeed have a special talent for magic, which could not go unnoticed and not arouse admiration. And so, like a true angel, the lady said with a gentle smile that she did not blame her companion for anything, but on the contrary, was sincerely happy that the squirrel received a piece of magic from her, which became a true gift that enriched both of them. The little girl covered her eyes with her hand, involuntarily, squinting at the brightness emanating from the noblewoman, as if the aura itself was so powerful and blinding that it could overshadow everything around her, turning her presence into something almost supernatural. Suddenly, an unexpected proposal came from the aristocrat. She invited her interlocutor to become her older sister, and this request was so sincere and unexpected that it plunged Momo into deep confusion. Momo, stunned by these words, froze in place, not believing that she was invited to become part of someone else's family, offering her a place in their circle, which was so unexpected and touching that she could hardly contain her emotions. The noblewoman, gently placing her hands on the other girl's knees, realized that her request was selfish, but deep down she knew that this offer would benefit not only her, but also the second girl, opening up new opportunities for both. Furthermore, the baby's mother had little time left due to her deteriorating health, and this added an extra urgency to her request, as if she was trying to convey her care and responsibility through this offer. And indeed, as it happened in history, the Duchess could not bear the loss of her second daughter, who disappeared, and soon her heart could not bear the grief consumed by anxiety and melancholy, which eventually led her to her inevitable death. However, the noblewoman always lovingly cared for the squirrel, her little friend, and every moment spent with her brought her joy and warmth like a ray of light, dispelling the dark shadows of loneliness in her life. For a moment, Momo sat with her head down next to her friend, considering her unexpected and touching proposal, wondering how it could change her destiny and offer a new path for her future. Marielle added, with a warm and gentle smile, that she was immensely happy that the girl was now with their family, because she was not only kind, but also a genuinely good soul who deserved to find her place among them. Suddenly, the little girl jumped to her feet, her eyes filled with determination, and with a cry of despair, she admitted that it was she who had been selfish and shameless, condemning herself to the burden of agonizing doubts and internal conflict. Entering this house like a little squirrel, she received so much love and care that her heart was filled with gratitude for every manifestation of attention and kindness that surrounded her, turning this place into a real corner of warmth and comfort. Moreover, She found here two other people who in such a short time became as close to her as family, and all barriers between them disappeared as if she had always been part of this family without feeling the slightest separation. Momo clenched her fists at her sides, feeling her doubts finally recede, and with deep determination in her heart, she agreed to the offer, knowing that this was the important step she had to take to find her true place, her home. The little girl, with full determination, loudly declared that she was ready to become her sister and take a new name, Eureka, which was an important step for her, symbolizing her readiness to open up and accept a new family. Marielle, overwhelmed with happiness, unable to contain her emotions, immediately rushed to embrace their new family member, feeling that now they were not just acquaintances, but real sisters, connected by a strong, almost imperceptible, but unbreakable thread of love and mutual warmth. And so from now on, she began to live in the Duchess's large house, with a green roof under a blue sky, where days filled with happiness and care flew by so quickly that they seemed like a dream that she was once afraid of losing. The nobles walked through the city, and rumors spread with astonishing speed that the Duchess had taken in an orphan, a girl who became her adopted daughter, which stirred the hearts of many townspeople and caused a storm of discussion. The townspeople, with their characteristic mistrust, thought that the Duchess's family had been deceived again, since their naivety and openness often became the cause of gossip, while they were unaware of the complex games that surrounded them. They all looked down with a haughty air upon the little lady, who, despite her youth, descended from the carriage with dignity, and every step she took seemed at once innocent and full of hidden strength. Eureka, in her new blue dress, with her neat curls and bright golden eyes, seemed the very embodiment of cuteness. Her long eyelashes emphasized the softness of her face, giving her appearance something magical and ethereal. The city was densely packed with houses that lined up like endless walls, and behind them stretched a green forest, full of silence and tranquility, hiding in its depths many mysteries and ancient secrets that were waiting for their moment to be revealed. The gentle Eureka, with a sweet smile on her face, thanked them in return for the warm welcome they had given her, noting that this was her first official visit, and she was grateful for the opportunity to be part of their world and see how others lived. People led her inside, gently showing her the way, and she, with inner calm and confidence, walked behind them, feeling a slight excitement in her chest. This moment became another important milestone in her life, which was just beginning, opening up new horizons before her. Her main goal was to find that mysterious man in glasses, who always carried documents in his hands, and whose actions and name were hidden behind a veil of foggy obscurity, surrounded by many rumors and mysterious conversations. The weather was truly magnificent. The sky was clear and bright, and the sun gently warmed the earth like a blanket, while the inhabitants of the city went about their business peacefully, and children, laughing and playing, happily delighted the streets with their presence. The noblewoman was looking for a physician named Renat Cardine, who was recognized as the best physician in the empire, and whose name shone in medical books as a symbol of skill and hope for those who turned to him for help. The man was famous for saving the crown prince, the beloved of a sweet princess, in one of his novels, when other doctors, unable to help, threw up their hands and left the palace, leaving everyone in despair. However, due to his poverty-stricken upbringing, his path to fame was long and arduous, with many challenges before he became a renowned doctor, as the novel depicted his life of trials and tribulations. The girl thought about how she could help the character overcome all the trials so that he could ultimately become not only successful, but also gain recognition in the medical world, becoming a great doctor who deserves fame. As soon as Eureka noticed the man sitting under the tree, children were running around him, their loud cries and laughter filled with play and joy, as if the children themselves were the embodiment of carefree happiness. The woman sitting nearby was a nanny who spent time lovingly with the children, smiling as she watched them play and rejoice, because she saw how every moment of her interaction with them was filled with genuine care and warmth. Eureka thought for a moment, imagining how the Duchess might treat her as if she were her own daughter, and in her imagination, she saw them sitting together like mother and daughter, sharing comfort and care in the shade of a majestic tree. She imagined how they could sit at the table, drink hot aromatic tea, and exchange tender words, spending precious time with each other, enjoying every moment of warmth and closeness without unnecessary worries and concerns. The lady putting the baby to bed tenderly wished her sweet dreams, Her voice was warm and soothing, as if the night itself were enveloping the girl, filling her soul with comfort, peace, and invisible care, giving her a sense of security. Even though Eureka was not her daughter, the woman still showed genuine care and love for the girl, because there was a place in her heart for every child who needed protection and attention. Clenching her little hands into fists, the little girl had no choice but to firmly decide to find a doctor who could save her adoptive mother and cure her, despite all the difficulties and doubts that she encountered along the way. When she finds a boy who becomes her hope, she will send him to study at the academy, and there, thanks to his perseverance and desire, he will definitely become a successful healer, helping those who need saving. The townspeople who had brought the girl to the shelter exchanged strange glances, looking silently at each other, each of them trying to understand what was happening, but not one of them said a word, hiding their thoughts behind the darkness of foggy bewilderment. Suddenly, the lady nodded quietly to her husband, her gaze full of calm confidence, but it also contained a hidden support for his decision, as if she silently confirmed his intentions, trusting his judgment and determination. The man then respectfully led the little girl up to the second floor, showing her the various rooms, including a cozy library and other important spaces that filled the house with an atmosphere of nobility and tranquility. The man was about to start a conversation about a possible sponsorship from the little aristocrat when suddenly their conversation was interrupted by a loud noise that came from nearby, breaking the peace of the moment and attracting the attention of both of them. Smiling mysteriously, the man said that the noise was probably caused by the children, and then, without wasting any time, added that he would leave the girl alone for a while to go check out what exactly was happening behind the walls, where his curiosity might have led him. Eureka agreed to be left alone, and soon realized that the man had a cunning plan in mind. He was counting on money for the shelter, hoping to use her as a means to an end, but she was not going to let him manipulate her. Suddenly, her attention was drawn to a boy in the library, sitting on the floor with a book in his hands, his blonde hair falling softly over his face, and his gaze was innocent and focused, as if the whole world disappeared for him when he was immersed in reading. When they greeted each other, the boy looked up, his blue eyes reflecting shock, and he immediately became shy, as if he didn't know how to react to strangers who had disturbed his privacy, suddenly tearing him away from the quiet world of the book. He raised his hands in surprise and embarrassment, apologizing to the lady, because he did not notice her arrival, and Eureka hastened to reassure him, assuring him that everything was fine, and there was no need to worry, because she did not intend to scare him. The boy enthusiastically began to tell how he had simply become engrossed in a new book about medicine, and a spark of interest lit up his eyes, as if he was ready to share every discovery that the book had brought. Suddenly, the boy became embarrassed. A blush darkened his cheeks, and he quietly said that his name was Renat Cardin, pressing the book to his chest, as if it was the only thing that remained to him from the world in which he felt truly alive. Eureka excitedly asked if the boy wanted to enroll in medical academy because she had finally found the second hero of her novel who could help her heal her mother and realize her dream. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by the director of the shelter, stern and calm, with a sly expression on his face, as if he knew exactly what was going on, but kept his thoughts to himself, observing the situation with detached confidence. The man began to lecture the boy, pushing him to be honest, and urging him not to deceive the young lady in front of them, as if he was trying to warn him that every word spoken in such circumstances could not be trusted. And young Renat Cardin, as if frightened by the master's wrath, hastily began to deny that he was interested in medicine at all. He was lying, and Eureka could not understand why he was lying, because her intuition told her that something was wrong. Politely but insistently, the director bowed to the young lady and offered to sponsor the boy sitting next to her, hoping that his words would resonate in her heart and help change Renat's destiny. The man explained that Renat Cardin was an intelligent boy who truly loved studying and dreamed of becoming a doctor, but unfortunately, he did not have the means to enter the academy, which made his dream almost impossible. The young couple who owned the orphanage noticed the boy's talent and now sincerely wanted to support him, but unfortunately, they did not have the necessary funds to help him realize his dream and receive an education that could change his life. Eureka smiled softly, and a warm feeling of joy lit up her heart because she was genuinely happy that Renat had such caring adults who truly cared about him and wanted to provide him with a better future. Reynat Cardine began to refuse, unwilling to leave his friends in the shelter and go away even for the sake of the studies he so dreamed of, because his attachment to this place was deep and strong to leave so easily everything he knew and loved. However, other children and the owner's wife suddenly entered the room, and they all admitted that Reynat Cardine was very smart and talented, and that it would be better if he went to study and became a doctor, receiving sponsorship from an aristocrat. The boy muttered under his breath, embarrassed, feeling awkward at being offered money, as he was not used to accepting help from others, especially when he heard praise. It made him feel uncomfortable, as if he did not deserve such attention. Suddenly, gently touching the guy's palm with her hand, Eureka, with a kind and confident expression on her face, said that she was ready to support him financially, to help him enter an educational institution so that he could realize his dream of a medical career and become a doctor. With an expression of deep determination, the lady swore, placing her hand on her chest, that in the event of the boy's absence, she would take charge of the orphanage herself, doing everything possible to provide the children with a safe and warm place to live without letting them feel any loss. The people standing nearby looked at the boy with soft eyes as he shyly accepted the offer, and their hearts filled with joy for him, because they saw how shy he was, but also knew that he was worthy of the chance at the future that was opening up before him. The young man, sitting on the floor hugging a book, thanked everyone for their support and care. His voice sounded sincere, and his heart was filled with a feeling of gratitude for the warmth and attention that they gave him at this important moment. The room was filled with coziness. The soft sunlight that penetrated through the windows reflected the chest of drawers, with the box creating an atmosphere of peace that filled this corner with silence and harmony, inviting one to reflection and solitude. Eureka carefully read the documents, realizing that she had very little time left. She needed to draw up the paperwork for the shelter and provide them with sponsorship, after which everything would work out and her efforts would lead to the long-awaited result. The little girl sat at her desk, lost in thought, wondering how to arrange everything and what needed to be done to provide a future for those who needed it and to continue the path she had chosen for herself. She often thought about the Duchess's second son, worrying whether everything was all right with the young man, because her care and love for him were deep, and she could not forget his fate despite the fact that thoughts about him were sometimes disturbing and full of questions. The military camp was surrounded by tents, weapons and fires, and the evening was filled with the conversations of soldiers preparing for the night watch, their voices echoing in the darkness, creating a sense of alertness and anticipation, as if the shadows themselves were alive. The knight quietly asked the Duke if he should be expected for dinner, but he, putting his finger to his lips, ordered him to remain silent and calm, as if he knew that this was not the time for talking, but for paying attention to something important hidden in the darkness. On a rock nearby lay nuts like bait for an animal, beckoning with their quiet and mysterious appeal, as if they concealed something more than just food. And everything in the camp was filled with an uncertain anticipation. If you think about it, Johann often collected food from others, leaving it on the ground, as if he was trying to attract attention or simply following his habits, not paying much attention to what was going on around him. Suddenly, a chipmunk with a bright red tail quickly descended the tree trunk. Its movements were quick and dexterous, like those of an experienced hunter who knew exactly where to find food and was completely absorbed in his goal, to find something tasty. The men watched in amazement as the small animal, having taken the bait, now moved towards them without hesitation, seemingly oblivious to their presence, trusting its instincts and natural attraction to food, unafraid of danger. The little animal grabbed the nuts with its paws and began to eat them carefully, enjoying the prey it had found. Its small movements were full of care and satisfaction, as if the world around it had momentarily disappeared, giving way only to a moment of pleasure. The knight standing next to the young Duke laughed, noticing that this squirrel was obviously very hungry. Its careless movements and desire for food spoke of this without words, and the knight's laughter was full of lightness, reflecting his cheerful mood. Suddenly, Johann smiled, agreeing with his comrade's words. His face lit up with a sincere smile, as if his soul was filled with a bright response to the other's laughter, and his heart was filled with lightness, as if an invisible heaviness had suddenly disappeared. After this, the Duke urged his friend on, reminding him that if they were late they would not receive food. His words were decisive, as if they contained not only concern, but also a hidden warning that time was worth its weight in gold. The aristocrat, looking at the chipmunk involuntarily, remembered his little friend, another squirrel, who had recently left him running away, and these memories, like a soft pain, settled in his soul, forcing him to think about lost moments. The young man raised his head and looked at the sunset, absorbed in its beauty. His gaze was thoughtful, and his face expressed not only admiration, but also an internal struggle, as if he were searching for answers to questions that could not be found. Back then, the boy would often go out onto the balcony to wait for the chipmunk. Their friendship was special, and every meeting was filled with warm anticipation and hope, as if every moment was priceless and meaningful for both of them. He concentrated the magic in his hand, closed his eyes, and mentally vowed that he would do everything in his power to help his beast friend regain his human form, and his senses confident that their bond was worth the effort. And then, when the dream finally comes true, they will hug, and at that moment, it will become clear that they are not just friends, but a real family, connected not only by blood, but also by loyalty, deep affection, and mutual support, which strengthened their relationship. In the forest, where the rustling of leaves reigned, and the sound of a carriage could be heard in the distance, it seemed that all this was happening in a world where every promise was sacred, and every step, despite the difficulties, led to a bright and hopeful future. Reynat Carden rode in transport dressed in new clothes, feeling embarrassed by the curious glances that his updated appearance attracted, but at the same time, his heart was warm with pride for the step he had taken, which signified a new stage in his life. Full of determination and burning desire, the boy vowed to the lady sitting before him that he would study hard to become a doctor, striving to become the one who could one day restore health and happiness to his lady mother, healing her and freeing her from suffering. The young man also sincerely expressed gratitude for the financial assistance to the shelter, as it was this that opened the doors to a future full of hope, opportunity, and dreams of a better life, where every step will be meaningful. Meanwhile, Eureka, with a soft and confident smile, conducted a conversation with the princess, touching on the most important political issues that played a decisive role in the future of their affairs and determined the fate of the entire kingdom, revealing her deep thoughts and strategic vision. Suddenly, Eureka thought, even though in the original version of the book Mariel saved the crown prince, it would always be possible to change her fate, to give the ending a different twist, more fair and satisfying the interests of all participants in the story. For example, the plot could be changed so that the princess already had everything: her own business, financial independence, and other important aspects of life, freeing her from the need to rely on others and allowing her to build her own destiny. Eureka, feeling a soft warmth inside, smiled to herself, thinking that Marielle deserved only happiness because she had gone through so many trials that now was her moment to find peace and success. At the most unexpected moment, when her thoughts had absorbed all her attention, the young man sitting opposite her interrupted her thoughts, barely holding back tears, with anxiety in his voice and worry on his face, asking if Eureka would leave when they finally reached the academy. All the relatives, including Marielle's uncle, an aristocrat, known for his fame and influence in high circles, were gathering for the important event, expecting that his presence would give the occasion even more significance and solemnity. The man who was the princess's only advisor and had earned her trust was unexpectedly taken from this life at an early age, leaving his little ward without the necessary support at such an important time in her life. Eureka, suddenly touching on the subject of poisons, turned to the boy with obvious curiosity and asked what should be done if someone was poisoned, hoping that his answer would help her understand this important and disturbing question. Renat Cardin replied thoughtfully that the distribution of poisons in their world was closely monitored by the temple, which not only controlled their use, but also strictly regulated their distribution to prevent tragic consequences. The little lady shuddered when she was informed that the poisoning could continue for a long time, leaving her in confusion and deep anxiety, not understanding what was hidden behind this dangerous, imperceptible action. The sweet princess hurried to the carriage when her uncle arrived, her long dress fluttering in the wind and her golden hair sparkling in the sun, but she could not hide her sincere smile, joyfully greeting her loved one. Mariel joyfully stated that she was happy to see her relative welcoming his arrival with genuine joy, adding that her heart was filled with joy, as the arrival of this person was always an important event for her. The man, however, did not share his niece's enthusiasm for her frivolous and careless actions. Quietly, but with obvious displeasure, he asked why she had rushed out of the house so hastily without bothering to properly prepare for such an important meeting. The little lady's face lost its joy, and her eyes grew dim with sadness when she realized that her uncle, though he was there, did not share her delight, and this darkened her spirits, for she had expected his welcome to be as warm and joyful as her own feelings. Once outside, the man noticed that the air was cold and the girl was barely dressed, and his face immediately darkened with concern. He hurried to take off his jacket and throw it over her, not wanting her to feel the cold and catch a cold. The Count, with concern in his eyes, carefully draped his clothes over his niece's shoulders, aware of how important it was to protect her from the cold, and with every movement, his actions showed not only concern, but also unconditional love and a desire to protect her from unnecessary suffering. He carefully and thoughtfully placed black gloves on her fragile hands to protect them from the icy wind, and feeling how she sank into his warm clothing, he felt an inner relief that he was able to give her at least a little warmth. In the end, Mariel found herself all in her uncle's warm and spacious clothes, and feeling his care, she froze in surprise, barely opening her mouth from a smile, as if she herself could not believe how much he protected her and how endless his love was. After this, the girl shrank under the caring gaze of the nobleman, and feeling warmth with relief, went with him back to the house where comfort and peace awaited her, and she could again feel safe finding comfort in his protection. The little girl held her uncle by the elbow, telling him with interest and enthusiasm about her mother's new adopted daughter, trying to convey all the details that seemed important to her, and happily sharing these new details. The lady added that the girl was so similar to her sister that they decided to give her the same name, because Eureka became her hope and support the one who filled the void left by the loss and brought new sincere joy. As the wolf and the squirrel glared at each other, their gazes were full of hatred, rage, and resistance, as if each of them was ready to rush into battle, unwilling to give in and unable to hide their mutual hostility. Marielle was sure that her uncle would like her new sister, but instead of being happy about her appearance, hostility soon arose between them, and the tender affection that she expected gave way to a cold hostility that began to escalate. The girls sat at the dinner table next to a down-to-earth relative who sat across from them, and there was plenty of delicious food around. The little girl's mother, unfortunately, was unable to attend the meal as she was feeling ill and needed to rest. The man drank wine from his glass in silence, his gaze absorbed in his thoughts, and he seemed completely oblivious to what was happening around him, not wanting to interfere in the conversation, leaving everyone in the shadow of his silent and detached presence. Eureka did not feel the slightest affection for this man, because he yelled at her adopted sister, behaving with her so rudely that a feeling of rejection and deep misunderstanding of his actions immediately arose in her soul. Suddenly, the aristocrat, looking closely at the little girl, asked her what her name was, and Eureka, holding back her excitement, modestly said her name, not expecting that his next question would be so unpleasant and would put her in an awkward position. But then, the man interrupted her with a slight displeasure in his voice, declaring that he did not mean the family name that her family gave her, but her real name given to her by blood, which immediately put her in an awkward position and made her feel uncomfortable. The little girl, blushing with embarrassment, and with a slight blush on her cheeks, quietly said that her name was Kamani, which her sister had given her, trying to hide the awkwardness caused by this unexpected and possibly awkward question. The Count, upon hearing this name, froze in shock, because such a name was usually given to pets, and he could not understand how it could be chosen for a person, especially for such a young girl, which caused him a feeling of confusion and bewilderment. After the meal, the Count began to discuss his niece, pointing out her obvious failures in managing the household affairs and family finances, which led to chaos in the life of their family and also attracted strangers into their home, which in his opinion only worsened the situation. Marielle remained silent, but inside Eureka felt her heart filling with anger. How dare this man speak such cruel words about the sweet princess, about a person who, despite all the difficulties, continued to maintain her kindness and respect for others. The sister's hand gently rested on the girl's palm, her gentle gesture full of care and support, creating an atmosphere in that moment in which the girl could feel that there was someone nearby who was always ready to come to her aid and comfort her. The lady, with a determined and stern expression on her face, said that she had previously established one important condition in her family, which became the basis for all her subsequent actions and decisions on which the stability of their life was based. Looking down and pausing for a moment, she added that, after carefully analyzing the situation, she had been able to increase taxes, which had significantly increased the income coming from the citizens of the duchy, ensuring the prosperity of her reign. For a moment, it seemed to the Count that his brother was standing in front of him. The little girl resembled her father so much that this moment became for him like a memory of the past that flashed through his thoughts, filling his soul with nostalgia. After her speech, the lady returned to the table, placing her hand on her sister's lap, and smiling admitted that Eureka had instantly come to her aid, and she was grateful for her support at that moment, for not leaving her in a difficult situation. The Count frowned, but restrainedly confirmed that his brother was indeed an intelligent and capable man who had achieved considerable success at his age, which of course aroused in him deep respect and pride for the one whom he always considered a role model. Eureka, shyly pressing her hand to her chest, felt how awkward she became when her relative asked the man to behave more restrained and more respectfully towards their new family member, which put her in an uncomfortable position. The man was about to say something in response, assuring that he believed in the true future of Eureka, when suddenly the door began to open and a guest entered the room, who abruptly interrupted the conversation and brought new intrigue to what was happening. The aristocrat stood up from his seat as soon as he saw who had come to see them. He was shocked because in front of him stood an amazing duchess, who, despite her elegance, evoked in him feelings of surprise and genuine admiration. The duchess, with a smile that seemed to sit on her shoulders, entered the room and greeted everyone present. Her posture and friendliness seemed to fill the atmosphere with warmth and light, creating a cozy impression. After this, the noblewoman went to her second daughter, and noticing Eureka also greeted her, extending her hands in a warm gesture that expressed a willingness to communicate and affection for the family that had gathered together. The lady, with a tired but sincere smile, said that if it weren't for her health problems, she would gladly go anywhere with her daughter, but unfortunately, her condition did not allow her to follow her daughters on their adventures and travels. The Count watched the scene with interest, his eyes wide open, fascinated by the elegant and harmonious way in which the picture of the ideal family was being recreated before him, and his thoughts were carried away by the events taking place right now. The aristocrat and her two daughters looked like the perfect family. They communicated with each other with such naturalness and friendliness that it was impossible not to notice their mutual respect and affection, creating an atmosphere of family comfort. However, soon the girls left the room, and only Eureka dear and her uncle remained in the room, where there was still a lot of food on the large table, but the silence seemed to be heavier than all the loud conversations that had once sounded here. The little girl, absorbed in her despondency, ate slowly and reluctantly, in silence, feeling afraid of the man sitting next to her, and it seemed that her nerves were about to give way, when suddenly the relative broke the silence and began to talk. Unexpectedly, the handsome man, realizing his guilt, apologized to the girl for his earlier rude behavior, and although his words were sincere for Eureka, this became an unpleasant moment, making her even more embarrassed. His voice suddenly became soft, beautiful, and polite, as if he realized the importance of the moment, and the nobleman acknowledged that Eureka was truly a good child who deserved not only care, but also respect like a real member of the family. It turned out that Marielle was going through a difficult time because, as the head of the family, she was faced with enormous expectations and responsibilities that she could not always cope with, which worried her relatives, especially her brother. The nobleman clenched his fist, just imagining that something bad could happen to his beloved niece. His heart sank with anxiety, because he was worried about her and was ready to do everything to protect her from any troubles. Afterwards, he explained that, as hard as it was for him, he was also very worried that if Mariel left, all of her responsibilities related to the family would fall on Eureka's shoulders, and she would have no choice but to take on this burden of responsibility. The girl was completely shocked to learn that the man was not actually bad, but was simply concerned about the well-being of the young ladies, which was an unexpected discovery for her, and made her see him from a different side. At that moment, Eureka, having gathered her courage, decided to speak and express her gratitude to the Count for his concern, but despite the sincerity of her words, he looked up in surprise, as if he had not expected such a display of sincerity and warmth from her. Despite this, Eureka still wanted to stay in their duchy, the symbol of which was a bird that personified freedom, because it was in this place that she felt truly free and wanted to be a part of this land. The little girl loudly admitted that she did not want to harm either the Count or his family, but simply enjoyed the time spent with her adoptive sister and the Duchess, because for her they became a real family in which love and understanding reigned. Eureka passionately dreamed that the life of the Duchess's family would finally improve, that her health would return, and that happiness would once again bring smiles to the faces of her loved ones, so that the long-awaited peace and harmony, filled with light and warmth, would once again reign in the house. And indeed, during the time that Eureka spent next to the Duchess, she felt an improvement. A healthy blush played on her cheeks, and her face beamed as if fate itself had smiled favorably on her. The man, expressing sincere gratitude, thanked little Eureka for being by the aristocrat's side all this time, as her care and attention played an important role in her recovery and general well-being. The girl, slightly embarrassed by the words of gratitude, stood frozen in confusion, unable to understand how her simple presence could have such a powerful effect on those around her and influence their lives in such a way. The man no longer looked like a sinister man. In fact, he turned out to be a kind and sincere person, hiding his kindness behind a stern exterior. But now his true face became obvious to everyone. A dark, long corridor engulfed in boundless darkness, in which there was no light, no flickering candles, only an endless emptiness, creating a depressing feeling of abandonment and oblivion, as if this place had been forgotten by time and abandoned by everyone. Eureka walked slowly down this long passage, with a basket in her hands, immersed in thoughts about who could have so vilely tried to poison the Count, what secrets were hidden behind this evil, and what could have served as the reason for such an act. She, a little confused, stopped at the large doors of the stranger's chambers, nervously adjusting the basket, and then hesitantly knocked, feeling her heart beat faster from tension and excitement before the upcoming meeting. The nobleman, absorbed in sorting through documents, suddenly froze in surprise when Kamani, a man he had not predicted, suddenly appeared before him, shock and utter bewilderment reflected in his eyes, as if the world around him had suddenly turned upside down. The little girl greeted the man politely, and pointing to the basket of sandwiches, noted that the nobleman had eaten very little. The lady watched his reaction closely, realizing how little he had managed to eat before. The man, looking at her gestures, slightly wrinkled his brow, because it was already late, and night was not the most appropriate time for a meal, but he said nothing. He doubted that he was not accustomed to nighttime treats. But before he could refuse such a kind gesture, the little lady was already deftly arranging plates on the table and carefully placing delicious sandwiches on top. Her movements were confident and quick, as if she had long been accustomed to such things. The food looked incredibly appetizing on the tray, and the smell emanating from it was surprisingly pleasant, filling the air with subtle, enticing aromas that were impossible to ignore and instantly whetted everyone's appetite. The Count was genuinely impressed when, sitting down at the table opposite the girl, he heard her confidently declare that these sandwiches were prepared by her own hands. He looked at her with interest, amazed by her culinary skill and dexterity. Having tasted the food, the nobleman, despite his habit of hiding his emotions, could not lie and admit that the food was tasteless because it was truly pleasant and surprisingly tasty, pleasantly surprising him with its refined taste and subtle aroma. At this point, Eureka, who had been watching him with curiosity, wondered if her interlocutor had noticed something unusual or strange in what was happening, perhaps a danger to him or someone's intention to secretly harm him, but everything seemed too calm. The man, without hiding his calm demeanor, responded with a categorical refusal, but added that if something were to happen to him, he would like Eureka to take care of his niece and goddaughter, providing her with all her care and attention. The lady's eyes widened in surprise when she heard that this man's goddaughter was cheililinositis, who had suffered from poor health since childhood, and her frail body often failed her, causing the lady to feel anxious about her fate. It was this lady who was the main villain of the novel, hiding her face behind a fan and possessed by evil, because she was ready to do anything for her goal, even to the point of corrupting the crown prince and plunging him into her dark nets. She envied the main character, who had everything she desired herself, attention, love, and respect, so cheililinositis began to make insidious plans, trying to get the lady's lover and replace her in his heart. There was almost a breakup between the prince and Marielle. The argument between them reached such a pitch that they almost broke up, as the villains skillfully manipulated the situation, playing on their weaknesses and setting traps for each of them. With a furrowed brow, Eureka carefully asked her interlocutor if his goddaughter was really as ill as he said, not hiding her concern, since her condition, according to her, seemed extremely alarming and left no room for hope. The Count, with a slight nod of assent, sadly confirmed her words, declaring that the doctor had diagnosed the poor girl as incurable and that in her case there was no chance of recovery, which plunged him into deep sadness and anxiety. Perplexed, tapping her finger on the table, the lady reflected on the fact that according to the plot of the book, it was the princess who should have suffered from poor health, and not the villain, and this detail did not give her peace, causing a lot of questions and doubts. Eureka smiled slyly as she suddenly realized that she could use the current situation to her advantage and cleverly kill two birds with one stone, all while maintaining an innocent expression, hiding her true intentions. The nobleman sat up in bed, his eyes wide open, his dark robe falling in soft folds, highlighting his tired appearance, and his gaze directed into the darkness of the room betrayed the intense thoughts he could not shake off. He clutched his stomach and felt a sharp pain, and immediately thought that the cause might be simple bloating, but the discomfort only intensified, making him increasingly worried about the possible consequences. If the Duchess's second daughter had managed to survive, then without a doubt over time, she would have turned into a charming little beauty, enchanting those around her with her tenderness, grace, and natural charm. She would certainly have looked like Kamani, a girl with luxurious chestnut hair curled into soft ringlets, a radiant smile, and refined features that gave her appearance a special nobility and grace. Suddenly, a confident knock sounded at the door of the professor's room, tearing the man from the stream of his thoughts, and without getting out of bed, he gave permission to enter in a tired voice, internally wondering who could visit him at such a late hour. A doctor appeared at the door, sent here on the personal orders of the young lady Kamani, who, despite the late hour, insisted that the doctor immediately come to the gentleman and make sure that everything was in order with his health. It turned out that the girl had also been experiencing discomfort and complained of stomach pain after eating the sandwiches, and this immediately alarmed Brown, who immediately jumped up from his seat and began to ask anxiously about her well-being, fearing the worst. The young lady was lying in bed at the time, and her foster sister was constantly by her side, closely monitoring her condition and trying to comfort her so that she would not be frightened and feel lonely in this difficult moment. The Count, understanding the seriousness of the situation, firmly insisted that he was perfectly fine and that the doctor should immediately return to the girl, concentrating all his efforts on her treatment, since it was the child who needed help the most right now. The doctor looked at the aristocrat with a pleading look, begging him to allow him to conduct a medical examination, because this was not just his desire, but a personal request of the young lady Kamani, and he had no right to disobey her order. Unable to resist the persistent requests, the nobleman finally reluctantly agreed, and the doctor, visibly delighted, immediately began his examination, anticipating that he would be able to fulfill the instructions of the young lady Kamani and ensure the health of the patient. The Count's dark robe was carefully rolled up at its sleeves, and the doctor began to carefully examine his hands, checking the condition of his skin and veins, but suddenly his movements slowed down and his gaze filled with alarm, as if he had noticed something extremely ominous. The healer suddenly began to tremble slightly, as if something terrible had unfolded before him, but gathering his courage, he quickly muttered that there was no reason to worry, and perhaps there had simply been an error in the analysis, which he would check again. The nobleman froze at that moment, gripped by icy horror, when he realized that his assumption could be true. He might have been poisoned a long time ago, and he did not even suspect it, continuing to live in ignorance. Somewhere in the distance, surrounded by a dense forest, among the bright green grass, stood an elegant greenhouse with a refined gazebo, whose openwork columns were entwined with grapevines, and a light breeze played with flower petals, filling the air with their sweet aroma. Marielle, sitting at the table, was literally seething with rage, as if steam was about to come out of her ears, and the cause of her anger was the Count's former doctor, who could now, with a high degree of probability, be considered a traitor who had been poisoning his trusting patient for many years. Eureka, raising her finger with a sly expression, made an unexpected but logical conclusion. Sally Linositis was not terminally ill as everyone believed, but was only skillfully pretending, while in fact she was in excellent health, strong as a young bull. Apparently, The girl bore an incredible resemblance to the long-lost daughter of the Duchess, and therefore the Count treated her with particular warmth, took care of her in every possible way, and even generously supported her, financially unaware of the young deceiver's hidden motives. Eureka watched the proceedings with a satisfied smile, happy that they had managed to uncover the cunning lie of Telelinositis, who, taking advantage of the Count's trust, not only deceived him, but also secretly slowly poisoned the man who considered her his goddaughter. To a large extent, the uncovering of this insidious intrigue was the merit of the young genius Renat Cardan, who, possessing outstanding knowledge in medicine, promptly suggested to the lady what exactly the poison could be, what its properties were, and how it could be detected. It turned out that there was only one rare plant growing exclusively in the South, and it was this plant that had the amazing property of causing the poison to activate, causing the victim to instantly become ill, thereby allowing the poisoning to be detected. The little girl laughed joyfully, realizing that her cunning plan had succeeded. She had deliberately added this herb to the Count's food to test her guesses and help identify the poison, and now, pleased with herself, she calmly took a cup of tea and took a small sip. The princess suddenly interrupted the fun by asking if Eureka herself was feeling well, since her health had been a cause for concern, and this was precisely what her uncle had recently asked her about, worrying about his niece and wanting to make sure that everything was all right. However, Kamini only waved off all the thanks and concern, with a slight smile, not wanting to attach any importance to it, because the most important thing for her was to help the Count, and her own well-being was not worth making a subject of discussion. The dark, narrow corridor, lit only by the flickering flame of a single candle, cast strange, barely perceptible shadows on the cold, time-worn stone walls, filling the space with a hidden mystery, an enigmatic whisper of the past. The Count, maintaining complete composure, confidently descended the steep stairs, his steps echoing loudly off the walls, filling the space with a measured, mesmerizing rhythm, as if it were a predetermined path into the unknowns. Little Eureka followed him carefully, trying to keep up, because the aristocrat had promised to show her a place that he considered truly special, and now the girl was trembling with anticipation of what awaited them ahead. Finally, a massive wooden door appeared ahead, slightly open, as if beckoning inside, and behind it opened a spacious room, the walls of which were hung with majestic paintings filled with mysterious scenes. Eureka shuddered, barely having time to realize where exactly they had brought her, because this hall turned out to be not just beautiful. In its solemn silence, one could sense something ancient, filled with the inexpressible power of the past, the secrets that had lived here for centuries. The Count, waving his hand towards the majestic canvases, calmly explained that this hall contained portraits of all the former heads of their ancient family, captured in paint for posterity, so that their memory would not fade and their images would remain for centuries, reminding them of the past. One of the central canvases depicted Oscar, the current head of the family, a man of rare, almost aristocratic beauty, in an elegant outfit with a fur cape, confidently clutching an elegant cane in his hand. Besides his image, the walls were adorned with other portraits, majestic men, refined women, captured with skillful brushes, each with its own expression, its own features, its own secrets, but they all belonged to the same family, the same blood. Eureka, looking closely at the portraits, could not help but admit that her friend's father looked impressive in the painting. His stern and noble appearance inspired respect, and the thought that this man fell on the battlefield, leaving behind only memories. The Count, taking a confident step forward, noted with a slight smile that the Duke was the very man he trusted unconditionally, whom he always followed, whose decisions he respected, and whose opinion he valued, because he possessed true wisdom, strength, and nobility. And it was for this reason, at this important moment, that he wanted to share with his brother that he would never forget the kindness of this little girl, her sincere care, and the selfless help she gave him, and would keep it in his memory forever. The little girl, slightly embarrassed, raised her hands in front of herself and said with a light laugh that it was all just an accident, that she had not claimed gratitude, and that everything she had done was simply an expression of her kindness and desire to help without any expectations. Suddenly, as if by fate, the truth came out. When Eureka was brought to the temple for baptism, only the Count was in this sacred place, and he saw everything with his own eyes. The events that happened then in the past revealed the truth hidden for many years. The Duchess, holding back her emotions, begged the Count to leave the baby in the mansion, as she did not want to baptize her, seeing no point in this step, But the man, despite her requests, did not listen and made a decision that changed the girl's life forever. After the attack, when the handsome man came to, he realized that Eureka had already disappeared. Only the sheet on which the baby had recently been remained. She had been kidnapped, and this realization greatly shocked him because now he was faced with the fact of loss. He guessed that the family of the sick girl, who had previously asked him for financial help, was suspicious, but he still felt deeply guilty for not being able to look after his missing niece and not protect her from this misfortune. That is why the aristocrat, turning to the little girl, thanked her for helping him get out of the past, let go of the burden of guilt, and start living in the present rather than carrying the heavy memories of his mistakes. The man realized that from that moment on, Kamani would become a real niece to him, and he would treat her like his own, promising to take care of her, protect her, and surround her with attention so that she would feel completely safe and loved. Eureka, having listened attentively to his words, accepted the Count's proposal with a warm and sincere smile, promising to become friends with him and become real relatives, sharing the trust and care that now connected their hearts. Suddenly, the man interrupted the little girl, asking her to no longer call him by just his first name, but to address him as uncle, as if at that moment he had suddenly become older and wiser than he had been before, as if he had taken on a new role in their relationship, changing before their eyes. He turned around shyly, as if trying to avoid the awkwardness of the moment, and suggested that they go upstairs, leave the gallery, and take a walk in the fresh air to clear their heads and feel more free and relaxed. Unexpectedly, the lady's gaze was drawn to paintings of various animals located on the gallery walls, creating a mysterious atmosphere full of symbolism and hidden meanings, as if speaking of ancient secrets. Rumors circulated that these paintings depicted not just animals, but the ancestors of their owners, mighty tigers and other predatory cats, as well as loyal and faithful dogs symbolizing the connection between man and nature. The nobleman suggested that if she was interested, they could approach Marielle, who would be happy to tell them all the details and open up new horizons of knowledge and events for them, as if luring them into a world of secrets. The man's heart was pierced by an arrow of shame, and his cheeks were covered with a blush when his dear niece, with such sincerity in her voice, invited him to dine with them that evening, filling his soul with tender warmth and slight embarrassment. In the distance, on one of the walls, hung a portrait of a chipmunk who, as if in search of new adventures, was holding tightly to a branch, creating an atmosphere of wild nature in the room filled with cheerful and warm comfort. The forest, illuminated by bright lights, seemed alive and filled with energy. The warriors shouted, ordering a retreat, but the path was blocked by the enemy, whose forces left no chance for either a step forward or a retreat, filling the space with tense silence. The knights moved forward, their armor covered in blood, their bodies exhausted and wounded, but there was no turning back. The enemy was tightly surrounding them, not allowing them to escape, and they felt that this battle could be their last, a harbinger of the inevitable end of their destiny. Suddenly, with incredible strength and brightness, a light broke through from the heavens, blinding them for a moment, and raising their heads to the endless vault, they tried to comprehend what was happening, sensing something extraordinary and mysterious in this light. From this light, like lightning magic, burst forth, penetrating the earth with unimaginable power, creating a blue glow that momentarily illuminated everything around, causing wonder and fear in the hearts of those who witnessed this miracle. The men, standing in a daze, were stunned to realize that a magician was on their side, because they were already ready to believe that all the allies were gone, and now, looking at what was happening, they could not believe what they saw. It was the Duke, his breathing heavy and ragged, but despite the pain and fatigue, he extended his bloody hand in a magical gesture, and despite the blood dripping from his face, he was ready to fight to the last. The knights were stunned by the condition of the young man, who passed by them, coughing violently. His illness was clearly severe, and the atmosphere around him was filled with anxiety and an ominous premonition that caused uneasiness. The young man, in a reserved and brief tone, replied that he was fine, after which he gave the order to reform the ranks and move the front line slightly to the side, as if not attaching any particular importance to what was happening, despite his obvious fatigue. His companion, beside himself with astonishment, asked why they could not leave the animals alive, trying to understand the reason for their cruelty, perplexed by such a sacrifice that seemed unjustified. Ever since the Duke's disappearance, strict orders had been given to avoid tigers and not touch them, for it was known that the Duke himself had the ability to transform into a beast, a fact that inspired considerable respect and caution in their actions. With interest and obvious disbelief, Johann listened to the story, which seemed too plausible to be a lie, but deep down there were still doubts, as if not everything was as simple and obvious as he would like to believe. He then, with a slight smile, suggested that everyone pretend that what had happened was of no importance, as if it were just a random incident that could be forgotten, and continue to move forward, ignoring the dark traces of the past. In his mind, he remembered the little squirrel, who had the amazing gift of turning into a girl, and how they had been friends. She was a close person to him, able to understand him in difficult moments when he needed to cope with internal experiences. The knights carefully supported the Duke, helping him move forward, despite the severe wounds he had received in the battle and the weakening of his strength after the magical attack. But they were determined because they could not leave their leader in trouble. During this time, Eureka spent time with her foster sister, helping her with paperwork, immersing herself in important yet mundane tasks that she carried out with genuine attention and care, enjoying every moment of their close communication. From time to time, she visited a boy named Renat Cardine, whom she helped enter a magical academy, having pulled him out of an orphanage, and was always happy to see how he took steps forward in his life, finding his place in this world. And even at the orphanage itself, the children always greeted her with genuine joy, filling the space with joy and light as soon as she appeared. Each of their cries was like a warm and tender greeting that warmed her soul, making her forget the burden of everyday worries. In her free time, Eureka often went on picnics with the Duchess and her adopted sister, where they enjoyed tea conversation and peace, forgetting all their worries for a while and enjoying each other's closeness. Time passed and autumn came unexpectedly. Quickly, the Count arrived at this time, scolding Kamani for her light clothes, because it was cold outside and the winter wind penetrated into the very corners, reminding that winter is just around the corner, and it is worth preparing. Winter had passed, giving way to spring, and the palace still stood majestically, its long, high-ceilinged corridors adorned with statues, and its gardens, once again alive with life, filled this vast world with freshness and color. Mariel walked forward confidently, holding an important paper in her hands. Her gaze was cold and determined, and her new dress decorated with lace flowed beautifully behind her, giving her appearance elegance and grace, as if she were an integral part of this world. Taking a step forward, she shouted loudly for her sister, her voice echoing in the empty corridor, full of excitement and impatience, as if fate itself was calling her to a great event that seemed about to happen. Eureka turned around. She was standing on the balcony, her gaze focused on the distant horizon, and then she learned that a strange telegram had arrived, giving no clue as to what events were hidden behind this unexpected and mysterious news. The girl looked truly exquisite in her new blue dress, like a true noblewoman adorned with precious stones, her face shining with light. When she learned that the long-awaited news had arrived, the war was finally over, and peace had returned again. The noblewoman stood next to the Duchess, who was sitting in bed, and with a slight smile, introduced the doctor named Renat, who had come to see them, and who had carefully entered the room as if not interrupting the silence filled with anticipation. The boy, who had already become a young man, said with a smile that his mother was fine, she was on the mend, and his voice sounded confident, as if he himself was ready to take on any difficulties that might come his way. He spoke to the noblewoman kindly and with genuine concern, explaining that her condition still needed a little time for full recovery, but the dosage of medication could already be reduced, emphasizing that the recovery process had entered an active phase. The boy spoke about his work with genuine enthusiasm and a bright sparkle in his eyes, because helping people and healing them was his childhood dream, which over time became a reality, and now he felt that he was finally doing what he was created for. 5 years had passed since that first meeting between Kamani and the healer, and the emperor noticed the young man, appointing him the chief doctor of the empire, realizing that this young man possessed outstanding abilities and could serve for the benefit of the entire state. Many other noble families tried to buy the services of such a famous and brilliant doctor, but Renat was willing to serve only the family that had Eureka for his affection, and respect for her were stronger than any offers. In response, Kamani smiled and thanked the guy for his faithful service and high professionalism, feeling sincere pride that she had such a wonderful doctor who was capable of performing real miracles. Renat sheepishly covered his face with paper, trying to hide his embarrassment, and asked her not to say that, because her words so unexpectedly plunged him into embarrassment, making him feel awkward at that moment. He eventually became a doctor, and it was only thanks to her that this was possible. It was she who came to him when he was still a beginner, helping him not only financially, but also morally, and he will never forget her support, which played a decisive role in his career. Then suddenly, the Duchess spoke, looking worried, asking where her second daughter was, with an anxious tone in her voice, as if she felt that something might be wrong with her, and her anxiety filled the atmosphere of the room. Renat immediately spoke up, saying that he had recently seen the princess, and although she was fine, her appearance was somewhat pale, which immediately alerted the Duchess, causing her anxiety, which became even more pronounced after these words. The window was wide open, and cool, fresh air gently penetrated the room, refreshing the space and filling it with lightness, as if the world itself wanted to give a little peace and inspiration to its owner in this moment of silence and peace. The noblewoman sat at her desk, completely absorbed in reading a newspaper, her gaze focused, and a thin shawl lay comfortably on her shoulders, which gave her image a special elegance, creating an atmosphere of calm work and sophistication. However, her thoughts were interrupted by Eureka, who entered the room with a warm and sincere smile on her face, as if bringing light and joy to this quiet place, deciding to visit Marielle, and giving the moment a fresh, lively atmosphere of communication and closeness. The lady came a little closer, as her relative remarked that there was a feeling of joy and relief in the air, as if the whole country had breathed a sigh of relief at the end of the war and the beginning of a new era of peace and reconstruction. A warm smile blossomed on Marielle's face, reflecting her joy that these difficult times were finally over, and the world that had seemed so fragile and vulnerable had once again become reality, filling her heart with a deep and long-awaited peace. In the original book, it was she, as the head of the family, who was destined to go to the battlefield donning armor, sparing no effort, and take on the role of her deceased father, leading the troops into a brutal and bloody battle, where every step could be the last. However, contrary to all her dreams and expectations, fate decreed otherwise. The court ruled that her main goal was to marry the hero of the wave in order to preserve her family line, an honor which radically changed her path and destiny. It was thanks to this decision that she was able to find peace, devoting herself to the duties of a duchess, immersing herself in endless paperwork and documents, managing the most important affairs, and maintaining order in the family, which became her new meaning in life. And so, thanks to a miraculous calming potion, the great magician of the Johan Empire awakened, possessing incredible power and strength, capable of changing the course of events and influencing the destinies of many people, including those who were nearby. Confused and at a loss, Eureka wondered how things might have turned out if there had been no other lover in her sister's heart, for perhaps then their lives would have taken a much brighter, more peaceful path, filled with happiness. However, Mariel was already completely absorbed in her feelings. Her eyes sparkled with love for the crown prince, and in her gaze one could read all the tenderness and passion that she felt for him, forgetting about everything else, as if the world around her had disappeared. Eureka, noticing this, could not hide her feelings, and a little embarrassed, approached her sister, trying to find out why she had so little rest, whether she was really so worried about the upcoming marriage with the war hero who hung like a shadow on her life. The lady sadly replied that she had long realized that it was impossible to be close to her beloved, and therefore was ready for a marriage of convenience, which would not bring her happiness, but would become a necessity dictated by circumstances and nothing more. The lady did not feel any joy at all about her upcoming wedding. On the contrary, every moment of this event filled her with melancholy and regret, because her heart was already taken, and she could not rejoice in this doom. How bitter it is to realize that Marielle was forced to marry a man who did not love her, and in this marriage, she was destined to become only a victim of circumstances, and not the happy wife she once dreamed of. She would have been a beautiful bride. Everyone around spoke of her beauty and grace, but her secret lover could not become her husband, and her look at the back of the lady who brought her so much grief was full of despair and silent pain.